Hello. Guess what? It's an 18 plus stream today. If you are not 18 and up, get the hell out of here. Go. See you another day. Just want to cover our bases there. So, anyway, it's another day, another stream in fascist America. Welcome to whatever this is, an attempt at providing education, advocacy, and a little common sense in this digital wasteland. I'm Aubri Devashrayee. So like I mentioned, today is an 18 and up stream. I wanted to focus on this aspect of choking that has been of more conversation lately, especially within this happening in sexual relationships, interactions with young people, but how this is a continued conversation from what we were talking about last week. I want to make a couple of corrections from some things that I said. I just want to try to be as responsible as possible with getting good education out there. I am not an expert on sex education. I'm not an expert on kink and BDSM. I am not an expert on community organizing. I'm not an expert on domestic abuse. So I want to guide us towards people who are experts and get some of their takes, especially when it comes to the latest research on the consequences of choking and breath restriction. It is going to be talked about within this context of sexual relationships specifically, but even within the world of kink and BDSM, that this is still a phenomenon, and we need to be as educated as possible if we are going to truly be engaging in a consensual manner in any sort of activity. So I want to revisit consent, what that actually means, and then also talk about some of these organizing points with choke points of striking within various sectors that are effective in limiting the power of whatever type of organizing we are getting in, especially. But this is going to be specifically talking about the industrial war complex, as well as helping with these larger strikes and understanding who has what power in which areas of work and labor, and how, if we are wanting to be as effective as possible, we need to have as much information as possible as well. So I want to highlight that, as well as this larger organizing education when it comes to a national strike. So this organizing for global strike choke points, or just strike choke points in general, I think is really important when we are talking about a national strike, especially if we are wanting to have this happen in a more timely manner, not necessarily just be waiting for the populace to up and decide that we've had it and then strike, but trying to be as strategic as possible, I think, is very important in any form of organizing and really any form of resistance. So we'll be talking about that. And since we are in this section of the Communist Manifesto of socialist and communist literature, we are still finishing this section, Reactionary Socialism. I wanted to get someone with more background on this, in fact, a communist scholar who can actually speak to this and how they qualify communist socialism what did I just say? I'm all over the place. Reactionary socialism. Jeez. So we'll get some of his input. We'll continue this discussion on decolonizing Marxism, communism, but just leftist movements in general, because we also are needing to reclaim what it means to be a leftist. We need to, I will reiterate, set the bar at leftism, not only at anti-capitalism, which is this traditional marker of what people are saying leftism is, but also have it be anti-colonial, anti-ableism, redefining what it even means to be able-bodied, anti-sexism, anti-queer phobic, which includes transphobia, racism, that all of these things must be considered if someone is going to be calling themselves a leftist. We have to redefine this, because especially as we are seeing this rise, this increase in fascism, not like it hadn't already been there to begin with, but globally, what is happening all over the world is that with this more overt, visible form of fascism that is growing in the US empire, the heart of empire, that it is being exported to these other places, and other places around the world are feeling emboldened to pursue these types of fascist measures. And people who are considering themselves liberals or leftists often have a lot of decolonizing to do. We are never at a point where that is finished. We must continually be decolonizing our minds, because the various tactics for propaganda and the powers that be trying to impose their will on us and oppress us, that's constantly mutating, and we need to be ever vigilant and also understand that if we are actually advocating for collective liberation, we must mean it, and we must stand 10 toes down and take on some risk when we are advocating for these things. That even if you are not part of a particular group of people that is oppressed, you must be for their liberation. But you cannot be defining what their liberation means, because only oppressed people can do that. And the means in which they find liberation also have to be defined by them. Because going in and trying to impose our will on other people is another form of these oppressive systems that supposedly we are supposed to be fighting against. So, that's my spiel. I'm going to be reiterating this just consistently. We'll see if my pitch gets more articulate, hopefully, as time goes on. But there you go. So, I wanted to start, just get right into things with a quick video from The Onion. This is from 11 years ago, and it is extremely relevant to this day. The title of this is called "Slamming Boss Against Wall, Shouting, I Need More Cash, Still Leading Tactic for Securing Raise." Oh, before we get into this video, though, I did want to follow up on what I was just saying about collective liberation, the rise of global fascism, the just increase, because it has already been existing in places. What is happening in Belfast must not be ignored. All of these racially targeted instances of police brutality, but also everyday civilians going and causing enormous amounts of violence to immigrants, that there are now these white nationalists, like as we have been talking about nationalism and a lot of its evils that it can perpetuate. These white nationalists are trying to claim that there's a two-tiered system of policing in which the police target white people more than minorities, which people are not actually minorities, just people who are oppressed. And this is just false. And rather than wanting to confront the nature of policing and how it inherently is this arm of violence of the oppressive state, people are wanting to point to immigrants, point to brown and black people specifically, and queer people, and say, like, oh, you're the problem. You are the ones who are oppressing us. And I think there has been a lot of misinformation and disinformation about what's going on there. From what I have seen with the coverage when it comes to like Irish news that I have seen, it is deeply problematic and one-sided. People are not actually interviewing people from these communities that are being actively targeted. particularly the Southeast Asian communities, the Somali communities, the Sudanese communities, and how there are all of these very like wishy-washy statements of like, oh, we investigated this instance of like someone being racially harassed and we found there was nothing to it. Okay, show us the evidence. What does that mean? So we must always be questioning these narratives as a part of decolonizing our minds and seeing through a lot of this propaganda, because it is incredibly harmful that all of this is happening in this global scale. For instance, I mean, like, it's harmful anyway, but just like all of these incidents are not isolated. It has been happening. Rohan Davis on YouTube had a post recently that came out on this topic, and I highly recommend to go read his post, just any of his content in general. He has a really great take on things, but he was talking about the need for solidarity, for collective liberation, and that the white people specifically who are in Belfast need to be condemning what is going on very vocally. And instead, people are kind of like not wanting to be as outspoken about things. And this is part of the problem, which is why we need to continue to redefine what leftism means, and that we must be for everyone's collective liberation, not just for not caring about the issues that only impact us personally or our pocketbooks or our family. That like we have to be very outspoken in condemning what is happening. But we have seen that J.D. Vance, Elon Musk, that they are blaming it on immigrants, that Nigel Garbage in the US, not the US, the UK, that he is condemning what is happening, saying it is because of immigrants. He already has been talking about how they are wanting to have a crackdown on immigrants and immigration processes. So, like, all of these things are connected. We will continue to talk about this in this stream today, 18 plus stream today, in the rise of domestic abuse and the hallmark of choking as an indicator for a desire for partners to actually wanting to take away the life of another partner. So all of this is connected once again. But before we get into most of that, as I just said, just keep bouncing back and forth. Anyway, I wanted to watch this video by The Onion. This is an older one. And look how cute. You can tell it's a little bit older with the branding, but I wanted to watch this. Very related to what is happening now and what we will be talking about today.
Calling it the most effective means to reaching one's full earning potential, a new report issued by the Employee Benefit Research Institute this week found that violently slamming one's supervisor against a wall and shouting, "Cash, I need more cash," is still the leading tactic for securing a raise amongst American workers.
We found that employees have the most success negotiating their salaries when they stride confidently into their supervisor's office, manhandle them like a rag doll, and demand more goddamn money right fucking now.
Experts confirmed that the majority of employees who managed to increase their salaries maintained direct eye contact with their supervisors while reiterating that they were not fucking around, emphasizing their position with phrases such as, "Give me the money now," and "I said more cash, old man." The Onion sat down with local sales associate Kevin Simmons, who recently applied these methods in negotiating a competitive bump in his annual salary.
I want more money, and I need my boss to give it to me. So the other day I walked right into his office, grabbed his throat with my hand, and told him straight up, "Start paying me more fucking money today." And I grabbed $100 out of his wallet and told him that was a good start.
I'm happy to reward motivated, self-starting employees who really show they're dedicated to rising in this company. So if you have initiative and you communicate your goals in a straightforward way, I'm here to help you. Starting right now, really.
I like how the caption said, "really," with a question mark, not "really!" exclamation point. Yeah, that is the question. All right. So I tried to plan things based on the theme for today. So as you could see, they mentioned like grabbing his neck and tightening as a form of trying to advocate for pay. That most of the time, truly, people are not willing to actually investigate or like have any sort of not even investigate, just act upon anything that is going to provide people more equality, give them more of a livable wage until they feel like they are personally affected. So, this is something that I wanted to highlight, just getting into the topic of choking, that the phenomenon that this is happening non-consensually cannot be separated from larger abuse and fascism that is rising everywhere.
Ever downwards into fascism. Hey friends, as America is tumbling ever downwards into fascism, I'm noticing these similarities between what it's like to heal from a sexually abusive or abusive household and what it's like to heal from and wake up to fascism. So I've written down 5 stages / symptoms. So the first is that it's the unspoken law of the land. Even though we don't talk about sexual abuse, it's unfortunate to say, but most people have experienced it, which is insanity. And it's something that often happens in childhood and grooms people to experience it again later, or perpetrators have been groomed into childhood and then perpetrate later. And yet nobody will tell you that that's what's happening. And
Yep.
same with fascism, right? It's this idea.
As we're reading The Bluest Eye in Toni Morrison's book, how like there is a reason why books that actually talk about abuse, especially sexual abuse to children, that these books are banned, because the system benefits from us all being ignorant of what even is the definition of abuse.
Idea of denial. We don't want to know what's happening. We don't want to see under the dark, dark depths. And so when you've experienced abuse and you're now talking about it and nobody wants to deal with it, and the people who do it definitely don't want to deal with it and the repercussions, then that's what the second stage or symptom is.
Hello,
which is the
Anarcho
gaslighting.
Taco.
So we're being gaslit into feeling that we
I like
weren't
the
abused, or that it
username.
wasn't that bad, or it was our fault.
How are you doing?
Or we're making
Welcome
it all
as
up,
a
or we're just trying
first-time
to hurt the
chatter.
family. In the same, literally the same context, you can just completely cross apply.
Glad to have you. We're currently, so this is an 18 plus stream, just so you are aware. I'm doing all right. You know, just trying to find some groundedness and sanity in all of this bullshit happening in the world. Okay, cool. Glad to hear it. So I don't have to kick you out. Today, we are talking about a number of things.
To what?
Whoops. But it is kind of circling around these oppressive structures and also talking about this theme of choking, whether this is happening in an abusive manner, in a consensual manner, what consent actually means, talking about choke points of organizing and striking, as well as like how to fight these power imbalances with various types of organizing, and revisit this with some academics talking about Marxism, communism, reactionary socialism, and then read the Communist Manifesto. So, by your username, it sounds like you might be in a place that seems to fit, hopefully.
Happens if you are talking out against the violence of the state, against the oppression of people and marginalized people, and it both of them, so both of
Glad
these
you like the
situations
topics.
require the same thing, which is the
We'll
third
see
thing
as
I'll
time
talk
goes
about,
on if you
which
continue
is the
to.
only way
But
out is trusting your intuition.
important
The
things in
only
my
way
mind,
out
all
is
related.
to get inside your body, to feel what is happening, and to be that confident in yourself that everyone in the room.
So this particular creator, Cheetah Recovery, is talking about the relationship between abuse, just domestic abuse, and fascism, and how like since we are living in a very fascist state, that A lot of the tactics that abusers use in interpersonal relationships are similar to the abuse that we experience largely as a society. Even school, they take young and install self-doubt to sell authority. Yeah, even the fact of like limiting this type of like teaching of like it's not an effective way to teach to just be like telling kids things. It's supposed to be like experiential and like allow people to ask questions. And that is the hallmark of a lot of oppression. It's like not being able to question what is happening. Not only oppression within society, but also like in abusive relationships or just situations in general. And then when we consider all of these things, we realize like how little power how little power we actually have in the world, which is like deeply frustrating, but also like good to be talking about.
Can be saying one thing and in your body you know it's another. And you either say it if you feel safe to say it, or you just move in the way where you know it's true.
Mentorships and
And that
apprenticeships
leads,
are good.
unfortunately,
Yeah,
to the
if
fourth
mentors are
thing,
not like abusing the power
which is a
imbalance.
symptom and a
I
stage
was an
of this process
electrician.
of waking up in such unspoken societies, where these are the
Interesting.
truths that we live in,
Are you still an electrician? I noticed you use it in the past tense.
which is erasure. The people who don't want to deal will erase you. They will erase you from their life. They will.
Yep. Erasure of experience, that's also part of this gaslighting, and erasure on a larger scale in society, these ethnic cleansing projects. I'm a safety worker for 15 farms in Australia. I don't know what that means. That's so interesting.
Call you dangerous because they don't want to deal. And that is painful, but it leads to the fifth thing, which is letting it lead you to a new world. Let it lead you. The Tower card in the tarot deck, let everything that needs to crumble fall away. You will find your people, whether that's mutual aid networks in your city, whether that's the people who will love you better than your family did. Hey, friends.
I love that she's talking about that. There is this misconception, I think, especially like growing up in a very like religious place where I am at in Utah in the US, of saying that like family must be centered at every point. And if you grow up in a family where there was rampant abuse, like that is a larger form of abuse in trying to propagandize people into thinking that like that's the only thing that matters, especially for like queer people growing up. Hi, like that's your first experience with like bullying and abusers is can be familial, and that we need to be talking about that it often can keep people in very unhealthy and dangerous situations. If you're American, you might call me OSHA. Oh, interesting. Do you work for the government then? Okay, so just moving along with this topic, just if you're interested, like as you're typing things out, if you're interested in sharing, no pressure. This was posted by Now This Is Impact. I watch some of their content occasionally, and this is something that many of us have been saying, that this is what will occur in fascism, with an increase in fascism, that especially when there are these oppressive structures being emphasized, reified, if you will, and how like historically when there has been a rise in fascism and wherever it has existed, it has increased instances of domestic abuse. And this is a very great illustration of this. No, employed by national head office, we have to self-regulate. I manage hella farms and accommodation. Oh, do you enjoy that self-regulation? Do you feel like it like allows you more autonomy for the work that you do? If so, that's great. Okay, so this is a quick video of that particular topic that I was mentioning.
Crime. They said crime's down 87%. There's no crime. They said crime's down 8.
Oh, wait. Chilling defense of domestic abuse. So this happened not that long ago. Of course, like one of the biggest abusers, this fascist pedophile in chief, is talking in this manner. But the caption says, man accused of abuse minimizes domestic violence in chilling comment. Yeah, of course. Of course he does. Because, like, we saw this in Italy, we saw this in with the origination of the term fascism, not necessarily the ideology or practice of it, but that there was a huge rise in domestic abuse, even in, and especially in, the households of people who were part of the in crowd. That these systems of oppression, like patriarchy and wanting to establish non-consensual dominance, that this has been a hallmark of fascism, like in Nazi Germany in the Third Reich, or like in Hindu nationalism in India, where, you know, like I am Indian, and seeing this also like have this increased rise in patriarchal violence just cannot be understated.
87%. I said, no. It's more than 87%. Virtually nothing. And much lesser things that take place in the home they call crime. You know, they'll do anything they can to find something. If a man has a little fight with the wife, they say this is a crime, see? So now I can't claim 100%. There's no crime. They said crime's down.
The way these fascists, especially in this party, the MAGA coalition, there is zero taste because they have no sense of valuing diversity. And clearly they need queer makeup artists and stylists to help them out, but they don't view us as human beings, but they want to like call us on the weekends for fun and then still indulge in dehumanizing us during the week. But the way that they are both so dehydrated and dry and wet in their makeup is very alarming. As someone with oily skin, I can appear very moist at times in the face, but usually it's like a whole thing. Like it's universally happening, not like all of these like weird areas. And I would call his hair a tumbleweed, but that would imply that there's like more substance to what it is. It's split focus. I care about workers. Head office wants me to shield liability. Interesting. Head office wants me to shield liability of for themselves, I'm guessing, in that instance. Okay. So last week, just to have a continuation of this conversation, we were talking about this video that Evie Lupine, she is a BDSM kink educator and does a really excellent job, but she was talking about this rise in the phenomenon of non-consensual choking when it comes to young adults and even teenagers. And this was a video that she created like in 2020. And there was also this mention in the video where she was like, we have seen the concept of masturbation even among young people go way down. And I think a large part of that has to do with the pandemic, where there were so many people just at home with their families and like not having alone time. And like that is an aspect of like where some of people's like first sexual experiences are not just like with themselves and like trying to figure out what people like, but that it's with other people, and that like with all of this toxic masculinity and like that being associated with aggression and violence and all of the like Andrew Tate bullshit trying to say to young men like you have to take what you want and not honor people's consent, that like this has just been a storm for a lot of abuse happening within these interpersonal interactions. So this is a follow-up from this video. I think it was like a few years after she made that other video. But this is where she goes over the more recent research on the long-term and short-term medical complications and conditions that can arise from breath restriction, just in general, but let alone when it is happening in this coercive manner. So this was a year ago where she streamed this, and I highly recommend her content. She is a really great educator, and I think has helped to dispel a lot of misconceptions about kink and BDSM in general. In my mind, she has been like at the forefront in leading a lot of correcting this. At least she's been noticed the most for it, at least in the algorithm the most for this, but she also does a good job of recommending other people's content if she is not comfortable with the subject matter, doesn't feel like she has the education for it. And I try to make safe office wants documents signed to cover their ass. Okay, good to know. Yeah, I'm glad that you are trying to keep workers safe with all of that. I used to work for the state government where I am located, and often I would just like disregard a lot of things that they said in order to like get, one, anything done, but two, that it wasn't just like perpetuating a lot of abuse, especially when it came to like working with community organizations. I would be like, yeah, they don't need to see this. This is approved. So like taking those anarchist tactics and doing what we can to try to protect people. Fake ass doms don't know strength as a service to allow space for vulnerability. It's not to control. Yes. Love. Exactly. And you don't have to say this if you are not comfortable, but from what it sounds like, you engage in more kink and actually understand what some of these power dynamics even mean. It's like, it's all about like earning. Like you can't just like take that from someone. It's like that it means more when someone is consenting to a power exchange. Like, but that has to be earned by both parties. I'm kink positive. Yes. Cool. Welcome to the space. I don't know if you've heard of Evie Lupine, but she does some really great education and have whole analytical frameworks for power dynamics. Love that. Yeah, I find it to be not only like really helpful in correcting just common mis and disinformation about like kink and BDSM, but also it helps to, once you understand these concepts, to apply them to these larger power structures and how we can resist them. And sadly, how we are not really consenting to many things in this world that we live in. So where we can actually take our power back, we should. So I love that you are doing that for workers. That's cool.
I don't
I'm speeding this up just a bit so we can get to more content.
think I have a problem with that. Oh, you're responding to somebody else. I thought you were talking to me for a second, and I was like, I don't think I said anything about conservative men. I think it's fine to want people that you share political views with. Honestly, I don't get that when people are like, it shouldn't matter if we share like the political views or not. Like, it's okay for that to be important to people. Like, would you say that about like religious views or like family views? Like, it's just as important for some people. Like, some people want kids, some people don't. Some people are monogamous, some people are polyamorous. Some people are religious and they're Catholic.
I think I went too far back. There you go.
No, things that are important to you. Like, why are you, like, I guess that's what it is. Like, why would you feel entitled to match with and date someone that you don't share political views with? And then to tell them, you're not allowed to not want to date me because of my political views. That just seems very bizarre to me. Like, why are you trying to force someone to be in that relationship, you know? Why are we going there? That doesn't seem productive at all.
Yeah.
Another choking stream? Maybe, potentially. Nobody's asked me about it yet, so I haven't talked about it. I haven't talked about the new choking study we have. We have new data about choking. It's exciting.
Okay,
It's new information.
here we
Newly
go.
published, literally hot off of the presses, the internet presses, and we can talk about that if somebody asks me about it. But nobody has yet. Nobody's asked me about it. wanting to give myself aftercare because got off of a relationship high and broke up. Oh, well, I definitely feel like you deserve some aftercare for that. And this is something like they don't use this language in DBT. They don't call it aftercare, but treating yourself with kindness and being gentle with yourself when you're going through really intense emotional experiences, I think is important to recovering from that intense emotion. So you have my permission. Aftercare away, self-care away. What was the book series? Oh my God. No one, if anyone knows what this is, this is, I don't even, okay, it's called The Book of the New Sun. And it's a 4-part book series plus a coda by Gene Wolfe. If anyone has read that, I will be shocked. If anyone has read the Book of the New Sun series, it's
The
weird enough that
gratification
I'm
for
probably going to
me
put it in my
is
dating
trust and
profile as,
growth,
like, message me if you know
self-discovery.
what this book
Doming
is
is actually a
about.
weird inverse where Dom helps
Can you
sub
tell us about
discover
this study?
self-limits, but
I
they
want to know
have
about the
power to
choking info.
seize.
Well, choking
Yeah.
info ye shall receive.
That is something that this also goes to show that you understand this world. What a lot of people don't realize is like that very concept of like, if you are a good Dom, then you are being actually very selfless in helping subs to understand limits and taking that responsibility very seriously. It's not just trying to like impose like these like impose power over people.
Let's talk about it. Let's go, baby.
But that also is something that like I think we need to talk about too, is how like that can be pretty exhausting for Doms at times. Like I think there is this a lot of, and this also just goes to show people coming in with more like preconceived notions of like what submission and domination is, like when it's like especially when most of the time people only understand this within a non-consensual context, that that submissives are the ones who are usually like needing most of the care. And it's like I think that just like doesn't understand the whole point of it, is that it's like you need like aftercare and care for both parties or all parties depending on what kind of relationship or relationships people are in. But yeah, it's a strain to be someone's emotional rock. Doms need space to be soft too. Yeah, exactly. And I think that especially like for having education with subs, of there tends to be like this burden usually placed on people who are on the D slash, like who are like more dom or topping, to always be educated, and that's not, and to do the education for submissives, and that's not fair. That like we need to be viewing this from equality to begin with in order for there to be like healthy and like true satisfying power exchange between people.
Okay, so one of my favorite people currently doing research that always knocks it out of the park is one Debbie Herbernick. I think it's Herbernick. It may be pronounced differently. I think we follow each other on Twitter, okay? We're Moots. We're Moots on Twitter, and today she tweeted that there is a new study, and it's called Navigating Consent in the Context of Sexual Choking / Strangulation, Findings from Qualitative Interviews with Young Adults. So I'm just going to give it to you. It's the full, this is why I hate this, okay? It's not their fault, I'm not blaming them, but like a single study. If I want to buy a PDF copy of this study, just this one study, it is $40. $40. I am paying for the price of like 2 movie tickets, 3. I could take a throuple to the movies for the price of just this fucking article, just the PDF. So I'll just read you what it says. So it says, sexual choking is a form of strangulation that involves using one's hands, limb, or ligature to press or squeeze the neck, thus reducing blood and or airflow. It's pretty much blood flow, it's really not airflow. And has become prevalent among young adults in the United States. Yet little is known about how sexual communication and consent occur in the context of choking, especially as some people may be unable to breathe or speak while being choked. True, accurate, a concern that I have. Qualitative interviews were conducted in January and February of 2020 with 45 undergraduate and graduate students who had choked or been choked during sex. So they're relatively small, but also it was a qualitative analysis, so it's, you don't have the man hours necessarily with qualitative analysis to look at a lot of people the way you do with like a more like simple survey study or something like that. And the results say we identified 2 broad things relating to 1,
academic
the
publishers are a
nebulousness
total
in the spectrum of
racket.
consent,
Yep.
and 2, the intersections of gender, power, and trust in relation to consent. Although most participants, this is the key part, indicated that it was important.
The previous video that we watched of hers, it was talking specifically how this is specifically targeted, disproportionately happening within these cis-het relationships, sexual interactions, and that it is this very gendered type of domination of like where young men uh are being in this dominant position or assuming it non-consensually and then engaging in behavior that is not negotiated beforehand. But I think it also is just like this larger conversation of how like people, especially young people now, it's like it's difficult to talk about these things for people who are not used to talking about it. Or like the concept of negotiation of like we would rather have people be safe than like be embarrassed for a little bit, and that that is not ever really taught whatsoever to human beings of like, oh, what's how do we have like a healthy, mature, informative conversation, let alone about like our sexual desires, if it's even in a sexual context, which like this particular study is, and the video we were talking about before was, but like how dangerous it is that like a lot of the time people are only first exposed to kink and BDSM like through sexual relationships when they don't have any education, when they aren't kinksters or like start out with understanding that it doesn't even have to be in a sexual context, that it then is extremely dangerous for people to be uneducated and then also not willing to talk about certain things or know that they can talk about certain things, go over like limitations and like what aftercare even means, that it's like this whole issue. And then now we have in the digital age where people are growing up like on social media, how this is just reinforced of people talking to each other even less and like developing those skills, developing more of like this threshold for being uncomfortable in having these kinds of conversations. And then also on top of that, of people doing less like in a sexual context, like experimenting on their own in like a safe way so that they even understand what they like. Breath play is actually way more advanced than starters realize. Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's also scary. Like, I talk about a lot of these like erotica apps as a form of propaganda because I think it has like normalized a lot of like pretty intense, edgy kink as a way, and without any of these like disclaimers of like, this is what consent means. This is what abuse means. It's like when you are not engaging in these ways in a way that is consensual. And that like many young people, especially young women, are growing up reading this stuff and not understanding that like this is a romanticized interaction that like people could play out like within like a kinky context, but they actually need to understand that consent needs to be involved. Otherwise, it's just normalizing abuse. And like even on these apps, there's a lot of like the billionaire's surrogate, my billionaire boyfriend. That's like, what? Like, okay, this is concerning. Like all of these billionaires trying to like normalize their weird like their own like weird desire to just have like a billion children and not take care of any of them or like their partners. It's just very weird. Edgy kink is built with trust. The videos skip all the trust building. Yeah, exactly. That it's like, particularly when it comes to yeah, like just these various types of edgy kink, like edge play kink, that it's like this is more advanced stuff that like people need to have some sort of introduction that isn't just like going all the way to like these edgier forms, and even understanding that it's like this can be fine within like a healthy consensual context, but like you have to be like talking about this, and also that like consent is something that can and like should be revocable at any point, like that otherwise it's not existing in like a healthy space.
for people to talk about choking before engaging in it, few describe doing so in practice. So people know, in the same way they know that getting tested for STIs is important, or using a condom is important, but they don't fucking do it, do they? Message one of the publishing academics on the study, and they'll likely send you it for free. Just don't mention that you disagree with that. I mean, I don't disagree with it.
Which there is, like, she was talking about this in the previous video that we watched last week, where, like, some of the bare minimum in, like, sex education, like, when we're talking about, like, choking in a sexual context of, like, people who have no education, basically, like, on sex education, let alone, like, kink education and, like, what consent means, that, like, there are places where, like, that is not even talked about, of, like, contraceptives. Like, where I grew up, where I live currently in Utah in the United States, it is extremely conservative. It's Mormon, very Mormon, and that we were taught abstinence. We were only taught about STIs. We weren't talked about any contraceptives. We were just talked about mainly like male organs, not talking about like female anatomy, certainly not talking about like any sort of like gender, like physiological diversity when it comes to reproductive organs. That is like, of course, this is setting it up for a shit show. They do sex education the same as drug education. Just say no, but that's not very empowering. Yeah, and it honestly is just to like reinforce these larger power structures, especially with drugs, where it's like, oh, so like any drugs like this must be criminalized, rather than talking about like all of these side effects, what they do, what are uppers, what are downers, things that should or shouldn't be mixed. And yeah, I think that's a really great comparison.
I mean, does it sound like I disagree with it? Okay, I guess I disagree slightly with referring to choking as a practice being about restricting airflow. I mean, I think if you're talking about this, if this is being incorporated under the umbrella of the thing we're talking about, that is restricting airflow. But it's very difficult to actually restrict airflow by putting pressure on the neck without actually just like killing the person. That's generally not what is happening. You can have a loss of like sensation of like ability to breathe, but it's mostly the blood flow. But yeah, I could actually probably just message, I don't know if she prefers like Dr. Debbie or what, I'm gonna call her Dr. Debbie. I can message Dr. Debbie and be like, hey, can I get the full study? What are the beats? Because I'm curious, like I don't know what they go into in the full article that's not in this summary here. Maybe this is just the study and I'm a fucking dweeb for looking at this. But anyways, to continue on, because this is the important part. Additionally, participants described placing a hand on the neck as a non-verbal form of seeking consent for choking or of asking a partner to choke them. I wonder about that part for the asking a partner to choke them. Do you put their hand on your neck, or is it like a modeling thing where it's like, I'm going to put my hand on your neck, but it's actually because I want you to choke me? Like, I want to know more about that, because it sounds like it could be either way. I'm assuming what it is putting your partner's hand on your neck, which, hey, if you want a clear sign of something,
devil, but then a doctor gives them, and user has no idea of death cocktail. Like, yes, exactly.
Like a good indication.
Yeah, and opiates especially. Hello, comrade. Hello, Oleana. Welcome. Some anarchists in the chat today, having adult conversations. My cousins love opiates. Yeah, that is something that, like, I saw growing up in Utah. I keep bringing it back to Utah because it's, like, a fucking annoying place. Hello, chatter friend. That like people are not taught about drugs at all. They're just like, just say no, of like the whole like DARE program that like essentially made people more curious rather than like stopping people using drugs because of like how they would just demonize everything. And it is really scary because like during the opiate crisis, how like people were introduced to opiates, like these like Mormons who are like, I've never had a drink in my life, I don't drink coffee, and then all of a sudden they're given these opiates and then they become addicted to them and then they go straight to heroin. Like there were many stories like this of like people that I knew personally, like family members, that it was like, okay, how does this help anyone but except for big pharma, and obviously that's who was desiring to benefit from all of this. I literally never asked your name, Lol. For me, I'm Aubri. But, you can call me what you want. As long as it's not like, well, I don't know. I shouldn't open myself up to that. Never mind. Although I would trust you not to call me something like out of control. I mean, especially as like a fellow queer person, there are many like slurs that's not a slur when you are reclaiming it, you know? US alchemy can turn minor back pain into full opiate addiction. Yup. Heroin is an opiate. You can get legit. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's why when people would have like these surgeries, like what you're saying, like back surgery, they would be prescribed opiates and then they would develop addictions and then go straight to heroin. That it's like, glad there was education about that. Thank you.
Like to have a verbal acknowledgement of like, because you want to, how hard do you want to go? How long do you want to do this for? Like there's details that are not communicated and just, you know, but it's a good starting point. It's a good starting point for sure. And then we have obviously the nonverbal form of seeking consent. Whomst among us has experienced a partner being like, well, I put my hand around your neck and you didn't say no, so I assumed that what I did was okay. No. We need to be actively seeking out a yes and looking for the yes as opposed to trying to ignore the no. That's wild. To be like, well, I put my hands around your throat and you didn't tell me to stop, so that must have been consent. Like,
imagine.
Yeah, I'm reading the abstract. I'm aware of what an abstract is. I'm reading the abstract. What I'm asking about is
someone in the chat trying to be like, do you know that this is an abstract? That's so funny. The sassy chatters. Yeah, and also this is one of the biggest indications, like a consistent statistic of interpartner violence, of when a partner is going to murder another partner, is when they have attempted to choke them or put their hand on their throat non-consensually, like in a violent manner, when they're having an argument that like this is not in a kinky context that is like agreed upon beforehand, and that like this ties directly into misogyny and patriarchy, these larger oppressive structures, but also like how I have brought up before, but like the number one cause of death of pregnant people within the US is interpartner violence. So like this concept of saying like, oh, we're pro-life. Okay, pro-life for whom? Just you? Because like, are you like, if you kill your partner who is pregnant, then you're killing, in your mind, like 2 lives or like a potential life that is like, okay, like a life that already exists and a potential life. That's like, okay, so what is the good there? It's not about any of that. It's just about this non-consensual control.
I'm not sure what else is going to be in the article. Like, are we going to get access? So when I say I'm not sure what's going to be in the article that's not included in this, what I'm referring to is like, are we going to get like the full text of those interviews? Are we going to get a summary of interviews? Like, what level of discussion are we going to get? That's not going to be included here. That's what I want to know. That's what I'm curious about. Obviously, an abstract is not the same thing as the actual article, but because it's a qualitative analysis, I don't know what we're going to get that is not included here. Like, what level of detail are we going to get about the interviews specifically? That's what I want to know. Whomst indeed. I actually hate choking and any other kind of breath control. Valid. That's okay. Yeah. I'm guessing they just say choke me. That'd be crazy. No. We can't just say that. We can't just be like directly asking for what we want. No. That doesn't happen. Let's get this straight. We are not against you for being, oh yeah, that's the whole thing. Yeah. I'm not going to engage with that at all. Mods, you have my permission to mute or time out that person. Don't worry about it. If they're harping on about that still and they can't listen, they're demonstrating their inability to listen to a no. That's my perspective on that. Participants rarely describe discussing preferences or boundaries related to choking pressure duration. Like, I mean, I get that. Like, I guess when I think about the times that I've done choking with a partner, I don't generally have like a sit down conversation with them ahead of time. That's like, this is, because it's hard to know, like, because it's so subjective. Like, if you're like, well, I want like a medium amount of pressure, like, especially if you are a heterosexual woman with a man and like there's a big size discrepancy.
As the company
and, like,
safety guy, please sign this training sheet for autoerotic asphyxiation safety. I mean, yeah, that would be very helpful. We have anarchist kinksters in the chat. Love that.
Generally, like, unless like you can be a relatively weak man and be a relatively strong woman, and it can be more equal. But there's also like there's a meaningful disparity in one's ability to generate grip
Do we
strength.
feel like there
And
is
so
a
that
lot
can
of
mean what is
crossover
medium
there?
to me as like
That
even
a
though,
lot of
like, I lift weights,
anarchists
I
are
work out, like, I
into
work on my grip
kink,
strength,
or
even though
like
I'm somebody who like
kinksters
is
are more
probably
into
more into their grip strength than the
anarchy.
average person is. Even I can describe something as like, oh, I
I
want
feel like
medium
there's more
pressure, but I can be with a
crossover
partner
with
that like
anarchists
is much
being
bigger than
into
me,
kink
is also working out,
versus
has a much higher grip
kinksters
strength, and
being
that to them is going to like
more
translate very differently. So I don't necessarily get a lot of utility out of like
anarchist.
being like, I want medium pressure.
I don't
I
know.
want it to be
What do you
lasting for this
think?
long. Like I think for me, what probably would work better in that regard is not necessarily a verbal conversation, but showing on them, this is the level of pressure I'm looking for, and then talking about like this is the kind of duration I'm looking for. What I generally tend to do, and what I think is probably like good practice to have regardless, is like tapping out and having nonverbal communication during the activity itself, and then being able to have signs indicate like I want lighter, I
Anarchists
want more,
are
I
all
want longer, I
subs
want it
and
to end right now.
doms.
Like having ability to
Anecdotally,
kind of like
right, got you.
modulate without necessarily having to have verbal communication, because it's
Also,
very subjective. Yeah.
Maybe that is also just they see state non-consensual power and they want to explore safely. Yes, exactly. That's how I view it as well. Of like, I think more anarchists tend to be kinky versus like kinksters inherently being more anarchists, because I think, yeah, people who are anarchists tend to not like these oppressive structures, and they can see that there isn't consent and want to do it in a way that actually is more freeing.
Oh yeah, I'm not seeing anything in here that's indicating like numbers. There's no numbers in here. This is just like a summary finding. No. There's no sort of like, there's no political science happening. There's no sort of trying to translate subjective experiences into numbers. I think this is literally just looking at commonalities in like the descriptions of what's happening. And I fully believe this. Like this is in line with what I know from my own anecdotal experience, from not really surveying people in a formal way, but hearing many, many stories from people. This is a common experience. This is not shocking information at all. I wanted to meet you for so long. I'm new to BDSM and I absolutely love your videos. You help me so much. Well, you are so welcome. Thank you. Hi. I do go to events with some regularity. I travel, generally speaking, I go to Kink Fest. I am probably regularly going to be going to Self in Atlanta. And I will likely this year, I will also be at Dark Odyssey. I will be at one of the Dark Odyssey events this year. So that's where you can meet me if you want to say hi. I'm usually at one of those. Oh, no worries. You're not late. You're just popping in when you feel like it. There's no late. There's just being here when you want to be here. It's not just young people who do this without negotiation, though I appreciate that there may be patterns. I've experienced this from partners 50 plus too, was quite surprised. Oh, yeah. I think it's not, the lack of a conversation is not age restricted. I think that is a problem with like sexual norms regardless of age. I think there are certain segments of people who are younger that may be more likely to communicate more because they've been taught about it in some cases more, or they've sought out that information. I don't think that it's young. I think, what I think is a trend is that a lack of...
I agree with what she's saying. In like making sure that it's like, okay, to be safe, a lot of us being like, okay, this is 18 plus content, especially don't want to be like banned or like kicked off platforms and stuff. But also part of the problem and how we are here is that there isn't any good sexual education for people under the age of 18. And how that is deeply problematic when it's like, okay, so then we're just relying on parents, like family units, like as I was mentioning before, that cannot always be relied upon, that can also be deeply abusive in and of themselves, where they directly benefit, like if there is abuse happening, on not talking about these things so people don't know that they're being abused. And also that like it's just up to the state. It's just up to these nation states and their principalities to decide, like the politicians to decide what can be taught on sexual education, when they have all of these vested interests and like these imbalanced powers. That's like, okay, so what is the answer? How do we make it so that education is available for people? We are not and in a way that isn't like encouraging of grooming as well. So like there are a lot of things we need to unpack there. Strict parents make skilled liars. Lost my V card at 14. Strict parents do make really good liars. I agree with that. Especially like strict parents who are very ignorant as well and like not curious about the world can perpetuate enormous amounts of harm, which is why it's like the whole like this is a very common phenomenon in Utah as well, of like homeschooling kids where like they aren't interacting with really anyone who isn't just telling them what to do, where they are around peers with a diversity of experience, or even other adults that can be like, this is weird that's happening in your house. Why is that?
Communication goes with sexuality in our culture regardless, because that's just the norm. Like across the board, age, everything doesn't really matter there. But what I think is a trend is we are seeing, and Debbie has studied this previously, we are seeing more people at younger and younger ages engaging in higher risk forms of breath control more often with more partners, and with more spontaneity without conversation taking place first. So it's not like, I mean, I have anecdotal evidence from people I know that are in their 40s who have told me that, like, when I was in college, this was not the norm, and now that I've gotten older, I've seen it become more the norm with my younger partners. So that is something I've heard, at least. So I don't think it's necessarily lack of communication is new amongst young people. It's the activity itself that is going along with that lack of communication is happening in greater numbers. So obviously you will see this across all age spectrums. And I imagine probably it can correlate with like higher exposure to pornography, because it's something that's like fairly common in mainstream porn these days. I think that might be a correlation point. But it is more common, like based on like literal decades of sampling of like what people are talking about that they're doing in like, I think it's like the like American sex survey for teenagers or something. Like we have a lot of data about this going back many years, and this is like a relatively new phenomenon that's becoming as popular as it is with people that are as young as they are. But it doesn't mean that you will not experience this with somebody who's older. Absolutely. Nothing is absolute, but I can see it as being more common in newer kinksters. Well, that's the thing. It's not even kinksters. It's just like people who are in college that are having hookups. Like it's not a kink thing. This is like a vanilla thing, if anything, as a phenomenon. Because for most kink venues, you can't really like do this at kink venues. It's like, if anything, I think people in kink tend to be more restrictive about it. Anyways, talking about choking. Okay, is there anything else that I want to read? Yeah. So, additionally, participants describe placing a hand on the neck as a nonverbal form of seeking consent for choking or of asking a partner to choke them. Participants rarely describe discussing preferences or boundaries related to choking, pressure, or duration. Yeah. Conclusions. We found that young adults rarely discuss sexual choking or strangulation with one another, even though choking or strangulation is a higher risk practice. Further, we found evidence of sexual compliance in which people choke or accept being choked to please their partner. That I'd want to see more of. I think that we found evidence of sexual compliance in people in which people choke or accept being choked to please their partner. I think that I'd want to know more about for sure. I think the rest of this, I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. That's kind of like what we already knew. But that, I think the details of that could be very interesting to look at. Policy implications. Findings can help guide policy related to consent, sexuality education, including consent education, and clinical guidance related to sexual choke or strangulations. Yeah, if you're seeing somebody coming into your office at like a Planned Parenthood or like a college health clinic and they've got like petechia around their eyes from being choked, like you'd want to be able to identify where that could be coming from. Absolutely. I think we're not going to get it, but it would be nice if like, hey, so we're seeing a trend. Maybe public colleges should consider having some programming at their sexual wellness, clinic about like safer choking practices or consent practices that explicitly touch on like what to do if somebody puts their hand around your fucking neck without talking about it first. I think, or don't be that person who does that. Do this activity or that behavior instead. I think that absolutely could be really helpful. Well, I'm saying, yes, kink is becoming more mainstream in certain ways. I'm saying that people are not processing this as being a kink thing. Like they're thinking about it in the same way that people think about like oral sex or pulling hair. Can those things occur in a kinky way, in like a BDSM community way? Yes. But they're also activities that people do outside of kink, outside of like kink as like BDSM community. Sexual compliance with choking is scary because to me that indicates I felt like I wasn't able to say no. In either direction, that feels scary to me. Either direction, that feels scary for sure. All right, we got about 15 minutes left, so get in your questions now. I definitely need to refill my water bottle. My tongue feels weird. My tongue feels like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's happening with that. My poor team had to stay in the office all day until we realized we could not do anything. It was awful. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. Currently recovering from COVID. Sorry to hear that as well. Hopefully you're recovering easily. Could you...
I think that's the last that she talks about that. College is kind of late. In my opinion, thorough education should be at like 16 in high school. I agree. And then also like how is this done in a way in which like parents aren't freaking out of being like, this can't be a thing. It's like hopefully we would get to a point in society where that would be normalized enough. But like by that time. But yeah. I don't know if when that is happening, but I agree. It's like, especially in like, as I was just talking about The Bluest Eye, this book that we're reading for Banned Book Club, where it opens with like this concept of Piccola, one of the main characters, like her being sexually abused by her dad. And it's like, there's a reason why they ban these kinds of things, so kids don't understand what's even happening to them. Where it's like, that's the whole issue, is that like children can't consent to things, and that like them not being educated allows for this abuse to continue. And so like even for like very young kids, like this kind of stuff is happening to them. And so like at what point do we deem them worthy of being an age of like actually finding out what is happening, you know, like especially if they don't have access to therapy, and like that's usually a class thing, and like adults that they can trust, because a lot of the time they don't even know like how to talk about it. So like at what age is it even normal? And this kind of like goes back to many aspects of like, oh, like the kind of like Rousseau argument of like creating so-called civilizations, whatever that means, which a lot of the time that kind of implies like this Western European idea of colonial control. But like kids growing up like just being around like sex as more of a normalized thing, and like having it like back in the day, like a lot of the time it's like in family units, like there would be like parents or like just like people like having sex, and they're just like, oh yeah, that just happens. And instead of it being like, you can't know about this, and then yeah, because like things can happen to kids of all ages and then they just don't know what's happening. Parent freakout feels manufactured by culture war propaganda. Yeah. And that's also like fueled by religious brainwashing, in my opinion. Like if your kids are going to fight in a war, you want them to know how guns work. Hello. Exactly. Democracy. Example of Western idea of society. Yeah, because that's been working out for us great. For the what age question, I'd go by puberty hormone stats. I think most disruptive around 16ish. Yeah, I know it is. It's an interesting topic, like especially when we're talking about like formal education. But yeah, I'm still like trying to like wrap my head around of like, yeah, I guess like when you are going through puberty and you actually are able to like learn more about like the physiology of it as it's like happening like to people's own bodies. But I guess that just means like not banning books like this so that like kids can actually learn about various experiences, because like that would save a lot of kids not knowing and like harm and abuse. Not to say like just them having access to books won't stop abuse happening in the home or like in other spaces, but like they at least can know that there is an experience that is not right happening to them. I'm a dude. Hormones as a teen give confusing urges. Yeah, it can. Testosterone can do that. I do take some tea, and yeah, there's like one of my doctors, like if like all you were thinking about is sex, you might want to like draw back on this. Like, okay, good to know. Good to know. Okay. So, oh, I did want to get into more of the like research on this as well, kind of what she was touching upon. Are these one of the people that she was actually talking about in that post that she mentioned? Anyway, as we were talking about kink in general, so I've been doing more like choreography because I enjoy dancing, and also doing it in a way that's more like activating my own consent, engaging with my own consent, and like being able to dance in ways that I enjoy that like was not like as normalized growing up. So I have a number that I choreographed and posted on the YouTube channel, and then like a more adult version on the Patreon. But I have an idea. I'm making an announcement for the next number that I'm doing. I'm starting some choreography for it. I'm choreographing to the song WAP, Wet Ass Pussy. And I'm going to do like how I did this last number, a more clothed version on YouTube. And then something that I think would be fun and cute is to engage in more of like a kitten perspective for the Patreon, because I think that's a fun play on words, and also that's like fun for me with pet play and stuff. So not to like constantly conflate like kink with sex or like eroticism, but like it still can be in some ways. Puppy perspective. I know. If there's any song that's like related to like puppy play, let me know. But yeah, I'm like, I think that'll be fun to do like with that play on words of like wet ass pussy, but like you're dressed as a cat. And I'm also like, oh, this is why I believe I should someday direct a version of the musical Cats. But that's a different thing. Okay. Yeah, Aliana, if there's ever like a song that you're like, oh, this is great, I'll try to think of something. Heaps of punk songs around I Want to Be Your Dog. Really? I mean, I love punk. If you have any in particular, send them my way. Okay. So this is part of the research that we were discussing earlier. I don't think, from what, like looking at the names of the people who are speaking, I don't think this is the exact person that Evie was referencing, but this is in the larger context of more of this research coming out in 2024. This dumb parent walked as close to a meter near me with their 2-year-old. I'm smoking and I'm loudly watching this stream. She needs to walk the fuck in and get... Oh no. So I'm like, there's an 18 plus stream. If you are not 18, get the fuck out of here. Ugh. Yeah. I could never be a parent for many reasons, but one of the main reasons, not one of the main ones, but like a side benefit of not being a parent is that I feel like I can just like criticize people endlessly and not feel as guilty. Not knowing how hard it is. I want to adopt someday. I love that. Yeah, because like as if there aren't so many kids that need good, loving, stable homes now that already are living and breathing. I do think the concept of like procreation in general tends to be like, once again, like religious propaganda and kind of like this narcissistic endeavor to be like, I can't have kids unless they look like me. That's like, okay, are you that confident in who you are to want that? Do you know the band Dog Park Dissidents? Ooh, no. I'm writing this down. On Fridays, so tomorrow, I do Culture Corner, where I go over like art or like aspects in culture that I want to talk about, or just things that I'm excited about. So this is perfect. I'll look into them and play some of their stuff. Band dog. Oh wait, Dog Park. Was writing as band as part of the name. Dog Park Dissidents. I want to adopt kids ages 15 to 18 because I know they don't get a chance at having a loving family as often. Yeah, exactly. And they don't get to be adopted as often, or like they just stay in the system for longer. I can't have kids unless they look like me sounds racist. Yeah, it is. I think it's a form of eugenics as well. Ooh, They look cool. Love. Queer as in fuck you. I've heard this song. I didn't know that this was them. Okay. Thank you very much. Love. I'll play some of their stuff tomorrow. Okay. I'm also going to watch this at a higher speed just so that we can get to more things, because I tend to be ambitious with the amount of things that I have planned, but I get excited and just like want to be able to cover a lot of stuff. Yeah, thank you for the recommendation. That's amazing.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Rachel Rubin, urologist and sexual medicine specialist in the Washington, D.C. area, and welcome back to another episode of Sex Matters. This one's an interesting one for you, and kind of shocking, actually. Some of you may have read a story earlier this year in the New York Times about the alarming rise among young people of choking or strangulation during sex. I spoke recently with Dr. Debbie Herbenek about this concerning and violent trend. Dr. Herbenek is a well-known sexuality researcher and professor at the Indiana University School of Public Health. Welcome, Dr. Herbenek, and tell us all about it.
Sure. This is, I think, some of the most important research that I've done. And so I've been studying sexual behaviors and trends for about 14 years in terms of like the U.S. nationally representative studies that we do. And over time, we noticed a trend in increasing prevalence of rough sex practices. Now, there's always been a lot of sexual diversity in the world, right, throughout historical time and place. But the main trend that we're really focusing on in recent years that I think is important for everyone in medicine to know about is this rapid increase, and it's actually really, really big increase in what people call sexual choking, even though it's a form of strangulation. And the increase is mostly seen in teenagers and young adults.
Great.
So we've done U.S. nationally representative surveys as well as college campus representative surveys. And we find that consistently across 4 campus representative surveys that 6.
That way I can afford to recognize people's human rights more easily. Yeah, truly though. When we aren't having to constantly make compromises in capitalism. I wonder if there's any correlation to autoerotic choking incidents. I agree. I think this is far less studied. I would be very interested in that as well, because this is primarily focusing on partners and like the non-consensual aspect of it, especially.
64% of women report having been choked during sex ever. And around 1 in 3 women 18 to 24 throughout the whole country report having been choked just their most recent time that they had sexual activity with another person. So they call it choking, but because
I do think so, like the study that Evie showed in the video we watched last week, they did talk about some queer relationships, like bisexual interactions, and how there is not quite as much non-consensual aggression happening, like with rough sex within queer sexual relationships, but also notoriously these studies are not really done in a way that is more like equitable and providing more humanity for marginalized people. So like not just like these queer identities, but also like how there are these other intersections at play of marginalization, like how that probably is a factor of increasing the likelihood of someone experiencing non-consensual choking. But I agree, that would be interesting to find out about those autoerotic choking incidents.
it involves usually one hand, sometimes 2 hands, or a forearm, or an object like a belt or cord to tie around the neck. It is technically strangulation because it's external pressure to the neck to reduce or stop airflow or blood flow.
And these numbers are staggering, right? So everyone listening is taking care of people who are being strangled as a form of sexual pleasure. And so what does this mean from a safety perspective? And as doctors who are working these patients up for migraines and other health problems, what is the research showing?
Yes, well, so we certainly are seeing people report recurrent headaches, ringing in the ears. I think there are things we've just barely scratched the surface on. I mean, I think that those of us working in this space, really believe that, for example, anybody coming in with unexplained stroke, for example, under age 50, you might consider some imaging to see if they have a dissection. And so we are hearing about people who, when you really probe and find out if they've had pressure on the neck, they may report that indeed that they have. So we have to be thinking about neurological symptoms. We know that they're experiencing them at pretty high rates. For people who are engaging in these practices, they should know about the health risks. We find that most don't. They may have heard that if it's really, really intense or sort of high pressure, that in rare cases
Imagine that
people can
most
die,
don't.
but most have never heard of anything in between. So they're not connecting necessarily their voice hoarseness to an experience of being choked, or the recurrent headaches that now that they're getting, or the sensitivity to light. So we need to be paying attention to neurological symptoms. Most physicians I speak with at conferences say that where they feel like they can step into this conversation is through anticipatory guidance, and just letting their patients know that, you may have heard about this trend, and a lot of people aren't talking about the health consequences, and I want to share with you some information. Not coming at it from a place of shame or judgment, but providing some information so that they actually get some medical facts about this that really could be life-saving.
I mean, it's really, I see such a big gap in, in my medical training, where I was told to say, hey, in the vice section, do you smoke, do you drink, do you do drugs, do you have sex, men, women, or both? And that's it, right? And then maybe, don't get an STD, use birth control, thinking about herpes, thinking about syphilis, thinking about
In my case,
gonorrhea and
neither.
chlamydia and those types of things. We weren't really trained ever to how to talk to patients about what kind of sex are you having, and how do I talk to you
Neither
in a
man
way
nor
that
woman.
is open-minded but also safety conscious, and and this concept of safe sex is now more than wear a condom or use birth control, but this idea of rough sex practices, and how to really talk to now teenagers, maybe our pediatricians.
Which a lot of these types of questions anyway, like, it cannot be understated the types of oppressive power structures that are embedded in the medical field and community of that education as a whole, where there are a lot of eugenics that are taught, a deep anti-blackness, of especially underdiagnosing, particularly Black patients, particularly Black women, Black queer women, and how, like, all of these other intersections of marginalization, like, especially when it comes to ableism, of, like, how doctors are even viewing people as being able-bodied or not, that, like, it is deeply problematic. But, like, the queer phobia also cannot be understated with stigmas with STIs, or talking about, like, not even providing that grade of education when it comes to, like, oh, you need to be getting this kind of testing. Here are these places where you can't even get testing. And that's not just, they tend to only target it towards queer people rather than, like, straight people as well. So, like, and cis people. So it's just rife with all of these aspects of discrimination. And also the technique should kind of be below the neck, not crushing windpipe, just restrict breath, but I'm character limited and dual focused. This is not legal. Yeah, exactly. And also, like, just understanding that it's like the more information we have with, like, medical studies being done and research is good for helping people to actually be educated and engage in safe play, whether it is sexual or not, and how, like, important that is to, like, actually have informed consent. Like, you can't be fully consenting to a situation if you don't know what all of the risks are, and how, like, they're saying that, like, we were talking about earlier, like, breath play is extremely advanced, and breath play can be very dangerous when people don't know what they're doing or don't know what some of the consequences are of even, like, talking about, like, restricting breath in general. That, like, there can be long-term consequences, like, to people's brains, and that, like, even still, like, we don't have as much research because of the lack of desire and all of this stigmatizing that happens in understanding the long-term health effects.
Christians even should be talking about this. So what, I mean, where do we start in terms of how to bring up these conversations, and in what level of detail?
We find that some young people are already being asked about some impacts that their body might show for them. So they may be, it may be that their provider notices some bruising, and or different marks on their body from other types of rough sex practices like hitting and so on, and spanking. And so that could be an entry point. Now, choking is far more prevalent than slapping. So if you're seeing some marks on the body, then it's also possibly a good place to ask about other practices they might be engaging in, especially higher risk ones like choking or strangulation. And so again, offering some information, and even sometimes just saying, look, I'm not here to shame or judge you. I just really want you to have some information about this, and giving them an opportunity to ask questions too. We have found that almost nobody talks with their nurse or doctor, even if they have symptoms from being choked or strangled during sex. So in our data, we find that just 1% of women with choking-related symptoms and 7% of men, and far fewer trans and non-binary young people are reporting talking with a
Non-binary, you say? Thank you. And trans people, thank you. Thank you for mentioning both of these populations. I'm someone, not all non-binary people identify as being trans. I happen to be for both of these things. But also how we were talking about the stigma within the medical field, like how this there is a huge stigma against like kinksters in general, of like, if you actually are needing medical help after something goes wrong within some sort of play, that there is a lot of judgment and a lot of shaming that people experience when they are needing medical attention, rather than just being like, oh, you're a person that needs help. It's like all of this, like, don't do this. And like, while people, like, if they're not engaging in like a safe way, like, there needs to be more education and understanding why something went wrong in the first place. Like, that's really important. But also, like, a lot of shame, or a lot of kinksters are shamed when they actually are needing medical attention, and then they don't want to get into the details as to like what was happening with a medical provider, or like an emergency medical provider, where there is a lot of situations that just don't get addressed the way that they should be. Y'all pay per doctor visit. Is that like per hour or per 15-minute block? Because it costs money to talk to a general practitioner about kink. Should not be gate kept for privilege. Yeah, exactly. It's usually like per visit in the US, but sometimes you can't even get into a doctor, like a general practitioner, unless you have insurance, which that usually comes through some form of employment. And not all employers offer this, and that many employers only hire people up to like a certain hourly cap before they start have to offering benefits. So yay, great to be living in the heart of imperialist capitalism. We get a lot of gate kept shit. Chat GPT is the US public health system. Honestly though, that's how bleak things are.
Doctor. Mostly because they say it didn't seem like a big deal. The symptoms.
So yeah, it seems like
sometimes they're afraid of
you all
being
have
shamed for their
slightly
sexual
more
behavior,
access
and that's why
to
they say they don't
some
talk to somebody. So I
information,
think,
but like,
they
even
need some type of
still,
open door, anticipatory guidance is a way forward. I think
wait,
not
do
everyone's
you
comfortable,
pay
directly asking,
per
understandably, if someone's
visit or
engaging in this,
15-minute
but at least letting people know
block?
that you've heard of this behavior, providing some medical facts, can give
But
us
it
a
is
step
also the
forward
same
with creating these
concept
conversations.
of
And can you tell
like,
us,
you
where
have
is
to
this
talk
research
to a
going in terms
doctor,
of next
pay to
steps,
talk to a
other things
doctor.
that you're looking at, and what are you excited about?
Well, I'm excited because collaborator and colleague Dr. Kay Kawada, he and I.
And it just goes to show as well, like, these larger institutions of like higher education and stuff, that they have to, that they are themselves gatekeeping this kind of information, which is keeping people oppressed. I don't pay. I didn't know that. Wow, I'm so happy for you. This is revealing my American ignorance about the world and your healthcare system.
did some work together
That's
that he led a
great.
couple years ago.
That's
He's a
how it should
neuroscientist, so
be.
looking at potential cumulative effects on the
Which
brain.
doesn't mean
So we're
there
taking some
aren't
of that
like
research into its next
other
steps. We're also
issues you
doing more
experience,
focus
but
studies on other health consequences, and hopefully finding out
yeah,
how we can also test different messages out
it's a
that are
shit show.
educational and get people to learn more fact-based information about this, and then see if it's effective in prevention as well.
To me, it sounds like a public health campaign is really needed about, how to get the word out there of the health consequences of these activities. And, we're really not often asking people, something in my clinic that I try to keep open-ended is, tell me what sex looks like, right? What does it look like? And what do you want it to look like? Because I see a lot of people with problems, but I don't go in, if they don't sort of bring it to me, I don't necessarily bring it up to them until I heard your lecture. And my mind said, oh my gosh, I'm not even asking the right questions. And so are you hopeful that there'll be more public health messaging out there?
I am. Years ago when the child adolescent choking game became a thing, the CDC issued, reports about this and issued warnings to parents. And this is a far, far higher prevalence than that ever was. And so I would love to see organizations like the CDC, I would love to see medical groups getting involved and educating their members and doing, big statements because this is, really impacting a huge generation of, especially girls and women. When it happens in sex between women and men, it's mostly, the choking is mostly happening to the girls and women.
Yes.
It's also prevalent among sexual minority individuals as well. But we are talking about this whole generation of young women and what's happening to their bodies and their brain health. So we really need to step into this conversation.
And when we don't talk,
And when they say minority, this is usually white people speak for non-white people,
about sex,
even though like non-white people make up the majority of the world.
And again, there are very few of us who are sexual medicine trained physicians. There are very few of us who feel confident and comfortable talking about sexual health issues, but people are getting hurt. People are really having consequences to these behaviors because of our lack of education, knowledge, and even discussions around it. So thank you for doing this research, because had you not done this research, we wouldn't have found things like 64% of people are engaging in these types of activities. That is not rare. And so thank you for doing this research. For everyone, how can they find you or follow you or look more into this?
Yeah, I'm on social media as @Debbie Herbenick, and I'm also on our website,
Oh, it is Debbie. Okay.
sexualhealth.indiana.edu.
I don't know if either of you watched SpongeBob growing up. You're like, I'll name her Mystery or Debbie. Anytime I hear the name Debbie, it reminds me of that.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Which, as we were talking about like grooming earlier, I think we were all like collectively groomed as a generation, particularly millennials, with like Nickelodeon and all of that bullshit. But also, I have a theory that SpongeBob, people who watch SpongeBob, it made us a little more likely, like the concept of striking was not as demonized because we saw it on SpongeBob, where he's like, going on strike. That it was like, oh, okay, that's what that is. You just walk around with a sign. Like being introduced to that at an early age. I think that was probably good for us as a generation. Australia is a split system for healthcare, private and public, split funding pool, and political attacks on public. That makes sense. The attacks. Unrestricted internet access. I was in chat rooms that were yikes. Oh, I can imagine. Maybe I don't want to imagine. Something that she said in this is like, yeah, we need public health campaigns about this. I agree. That would be great. But also, having worked for a public health department in this state, and also as like a media coordinator that would help like plan and like execute some of these campaigns, there's no way that would happen in Utah. It is very unlikely for that to happen in the US in general, especially in this fascist moment where there is all of this like demonizing of anything that's sexual, but like the people in power can be as like freaky as they want on the weekends. And it's like, cool. I want you to be able to like be a freak. I want you to like be kinky, but like not at the expense of everyone else, especially when you are like actively stripping away everyone else's rights and dehumanizing people, justifying their brutalization and oppression. So yeah, I think we have a long way to go for that, but it would be great if we had better public education about like, I mean, most things, but especially when it came to like sexual health and education. Also in public health campaign, media representation, because 50 Shades of Grey is the goddamn worst portrayal of kink. Exactly. Ugh. I don't know if you watch Evie Lupine, that creator and educator we were watching earlier, but she talks a lot about 50 Shades of Grey, and she's like, okay, this is a part that is wrong. This is not good. And that also, 50 Shades of Grey, like, led to this huge proliferation of like kink adjacent type of erotica writing that is not based in any sort of education. And I think that also informed a lot of the stories that are like published on these erotica apps that also happen to be owned by billionaires who are invested in like, oh, this billionaire story, my dominant billionaire, and it's just like an extremely abusive person. It's like, interesting. Yeah, we need more education overall. So, as I mentioned before, I did want to talk a little bit more about consent, what that actually means, because I think any of these conversations need to be centered around that. This is a video we've watched before, but we will watch it again because it is good. Evie made it 5 years ago. She has been doing this for even longer than this, but once again, I will speed this up just so that we can get to everything. The deranged fanfics that put my childhood favorites in kink is way more respectful. Yes! Oh my god. Fanfiction bless fan fiction. Like the kind that was before, like human beings just being like, what if this situation happened? Like the like Harry Potter, like, I mean, the Turf Island and J.K. Rowling bullshit, that's like a whole other thing. But like Draco Malfoy, I think like that was like a huge start to writing of fan fiction, where like the Harry Potter novels, not the start for sure, but yeah. Fan fiction, there is some really great writing. There's some really horrible writing, but there are some really great storytellers that like will never really get the credit that they deserve.
Is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. Today we are going to be looking at a pretty interesting model for thinking about consent. Just so you know, if you're not familiar with my work, I am primarily a BDSM educator, and so this video will contain references to kink and BDSM if that happens to make you uncomfortable. However, I think thinking about consent is by no means exclusive to kink or BDSM, and so hopefully, even if you're not into those things, some of what I am talking about here will resonate with you and will be helpful to know about. I actually want to start here because eventually what I want to do is have a more BDSM-centric video where I talk about some of the ethical frameworks that are available to us. You might have heard of SSE, or safe, sane, and consensual, RAC, PRIC, etc. All of them contain one very important letter, which is C, that stands for consent. And you probably know that consent generally refers to permission for something to happen, or an agreement that something happening is okay. However, actually obtaining consent and what good consent practices look like is a very nuanced conversation, and I think it's one we've been having more and more over the last couple of years. And so before I dive into those models which take consent as a given, I first want to think about consent in more specificity. And the term we're going to be using to do that today is known as the Fries model, which was actually developed by Planned Parenthood about 4 years ago, I want to say, or at least that is when I first came across it on Tumblr. And I think this is a really useful term because prior to having this, we really had a lot of sort of individual terms that were competing with each other for talking about what good consent looked like, things like enthusiastic consent, informed consent, so on and so forth. And what the Fries model does is it takes all of those various competing terms and synthesizes them under one more concise label. And as you've probably guessed, the Fries
If a
model is
decision
actually
affects
an
you,
acronym.
you
It
should
stands
have
for
input.
freely given,
That is anarchism
revocable
in
or
a nutshell.
reversible,
Yes.
informed, enthusiastic, and specific.
Talking about the
And what I want to do
crossover,
here is break down each one
anarchism
of
and
these terms
kink.
more precisely, have a discussion about what they mean, as well as some things you would want to keep in mind when using this model, in particular with kink and BDSM related situations. So let's go ahead and start talking about the first part of the acronym, which is freely given. Freely given means
Have you
consent
heard of
that
any
is
of those
voluntary. It is
models that
something
she was
is done
mentioning?
without manipulation or pressure or
I had heard of the Fries model, like when it came out with Planned Parenthood around the time that it did. But I heard of, safe, sane, and consensual. That's a common one that is talked about within kinky spaces. I have not. Interesting. Yeah, some of these, like the rack or like prick model, like I don't know what those mean.
threats or coercion. It's something that you give freely. And as far as the Planned Parenthood definition goes, it also says that it should be free of influence from drugs and alcohol. Now, if you are one of my viewers who's from overseas, if you're from Europe or the UK, you probably know where this is going, because I have talked about drugs and alcohol and BDSM on my channel before. And especially if you're not from America, your relationship to drugs and alcohol and sex and BDSM is pretty different. Around here, it's generally unusual to have BDSM be done under the influence of, say, alcohol. Whereas in the UK or elsewhere in Europe, it's pretty common to have that done. And so I think it's important to be aware of cultural norms while also seeking to have better models of consent. And what I think is important to consider here is when that
I did
influencing
hands-on
substance comes into
education,
play.
never
I think
kept
it's
up
very
with
different
term changes.
to
Ideas
have
are the same
a
though.
scenario where
Yeah,
you're already
exactly.
super drunk
If it just
at a
has like a
bar
different
and you meet a
branding.
stranger and you decide to do something
Was it
that
more
night
like
and you
through
black out because you're so drunk, and that's
a
just a recipe for
mentorship
a really, really bad situation.
type of
Versus
situation?
having a play partner that you already trust, that you've done this thing with multiple times before, that you negotiate with in advance, and then add in the intoxicating substance as the play is happening, as opposed to negotiating while already under the influence with somebody you don't already know.
Which also,
We have
if
to remember
you
that the
aren't
Fries
comfortable
model
answering, you don't have to. Or like the more like tried and true way of like, if you want to be a dominant, then you have to engage in like all of these types of like submissive behaviors, or like, vice versa. I was a raver, and there's crossover. True. Ravers and punk and anarchism and kink. I would love to have a study done on that, of like what type of scenes that kinksters are most likely to be in, like when they are introduced to kink in general. I think now it's more of like being introduced in digital spaces. But I think especially before that, of like people who grew up without social media as much.
Is a best practice model. That means it is showing you this is the best way to have consent be done. However, it is not the only way to have consent be done. And especially when you do have that trust level built up, when it is something where you are risk informed and you are willing to take on the additional risk that comes with playing under the influence, you can choose to make that decision.
That's
and
like what you
I
were
just want to call it
saying
out here because
in
it is something
Arco.
that will come up when we talk about things like
Of like
safety
when
and
you actually
consensual
have
rack and prick in later
trust
videos.
built,
So let's
then
go
you
ahead
can
and talk about
engage
the
in
second
like
part of the acronym,
riskier,
which is
edgier types of
revocable
kink.
or reversible. What this means is that anybody should be able to withdraw their consent at any time. Even when you are in the middle of sex or in the middle of a scene, you should be able to stop what is happening. You should be able to withdraw your consent. And as far as kink and BDSM goes, I think this is the most important one to think about when it comes to separating kink from abuse. With abuse, you can't revoke your consent. Nothing you do, nothing you say will get the abuse to stop. Whereas in kink, you should be able to revoke your consent at any time and have the behaviors or the activities stop immediately. And it's also worth noting here that the revocability goes...
Which just goes to show, like, if we're thinking about that aspect of, like, you should be able to revoke your consent at any point. Like, abuse is, like, not getting it to stop, not being able to get it to stop, that it's like, oh, we're abused all the time by the societies that we're living in. Yeah, you need solid knowledge of partner with breath play, vocals, unreliable in duress. Yeah, or any sort of like gagging in general. Yeah, these like edgier forms, especially when like what you were saying, when people can't vocalize.
both ways. It's not just for subs or bottoms to revoke their consent, but tops and doms as well. So let's go ahead and move on to the third part of the acronym, which is also really important for BDSM, which is informed. Informed consent is about knowing the full story of what's happening. If somebody says, yes, I'm on birth control, or yes, I will use a condom, and then they don't use a condom, or they're not on birth control, then that is not informed consent, because that's not the full story. They didn't do what they were expected to do based on what they said was going to happen. That's not what full consent looks like. And what is interesting with kink here is I think when we talk about informed consent, we are usually referring to not just merely knowing exactly what's going to happen during a scene, but rather being accurately aware of what the risks are of the things that we are doing. You know, what is the risk of a flogging? What is the risk of letting somebody's blood or drinking blood, right? Knowing these things ahead of time allow you to give informed consent. So maybe a parallel here with kink would be if somebody says, oh, don't worry about blood play, it's not really that bad, you don't have anything to worry about, without telling you what the risks are of infection or bloodborne pathogens being spread. That's not really informed consent,
Making
because it didn't actually
safety.
give you all the information
Do
that
what you need to do.
in order to assess whether or not you could consent to the thing that was going
Safety
on.
first.
However, there is definitely a debate about who is responsible for making sure that the consent is informed. Is it on the party that is going to be receiving that experience to be aware of what's going to happen to their own bodies? Is it on the person proposing the play activities? Is it on the person who's going to be doing the behaviors to someone else? And it is something that's worth discussing, especially if you are negotiating with somebody to do kink. It's worth saying, hey, you know, when it comes to informed consent, what is your general behavior? Do you inform your play partners? Does it depend on if they are new or not? Am I expected to assess the risk for myself? So on and so forth. Important conversations to have, and definitely a level of nuance.
Can I tell you important radio
Number 4 on
steps?
this list is
Yes, please do.
enthusiastic. And
Did
this
you
is
get
the one
that
I
other
probably have
transmitter?
the strongest, most controversial opinion about.
Or is
When
that the
most
word?
people talk about enthusiastic consent, they define it in language like it's saying hell yes to whatever you're doing. It's your body saying yes to everything that's going on. And I'm an asexual person, and so me being enthusiastic about sexual activities is generally not something that's going to happen very often. But that doesn't mean I can't consent to having sex or doing other intimate behaviors with my partners. At least as Planned Parenthood defines it, they define enthusiastic more as being something
Oh, you're
that you
ordering
want
it
to do
tomorrow.
versus something
That's
that you
cool.
feel pressured or obligated to do. And so I think it makes more sense to focus on it as behavior.
This is something in the previous video that we watched that I did not really explain as well, that I want to clarify that the ace spectrum is just like extremely diverse and large, and that this can include asexuality, but also aromanticism, that like romance tends to follow this very patriarchal, colonized way of like, oh, you are commodified, literally being indebted to a male partner if you are female, or even in queer relationships of like partners who are viewed as more masc, that they are expected to like plan outings and pay for things, that like that is a form of power imbalance. And I think that also causes a lot of resentment on both sides. But it's like if it's talked about beforehand of like, oh, who's paying? But like if the rule is that like people just pay for themselves until there's like something established more of like, okay, you can pay or I will pay for this, that it's like that is a type of commodification of like, especially like in cis het society, this like compulsive heterosexuality in romance, in being like, oh yeah, guys pay for things that, like, in my mind, in order to make it so that there isn't this power imbalance, that like even though there are like women or like femme people who are like, oh, I want a free meal, or like I can't afford this all the time, that it's like, if you don't want to have that type of like power lorded over you in some way or another, or to create that inequality, like you should, if you are going out, be willing to like expect to pay for yourself. That's kind of like my mentality, where it's like, if you don't want to have that sort of imbalance, then you should, uh, you really should be talking about it, and also just be willing to pay for yourself. Otherwise, you can put yourself in very compromising situations as well, where then people feel like they own you in a particular way, or like, oh, so you weren't like putting out, or you weren't doing this, or like, because they paid for you. And it's like, yeah, we shouldn't be encouraging that unless it is agreed upon beforehand. So if you're using Mesh Core, it's more secure since you need a companion device to chat through the repeaters. While the Meshtastic, every device is a repeater. Oh, okay. Yeah, the Meshtastic is what, like, you sent me information on, I remember. Has better coverage since every device is a repeater. However, Mesh Core is more secure since if someone triangulates you from your message, they just find a repeater instead of you. Cool. Money is power. If you let someone overpower you financially, it's not equal. Yes, exactly. Mesh Core is sexy. I want to get into the Aurora radio stuff. I know, that's what I'm wanting as well. The more that we can, like, I say this like to Aliana, like sometimes I'm like, phones are spies. Like any sort of digital activity is open to scrutiny, and also just like data mining and surveillance. So like the more that we can be off these systems that they're constantly surveilling, the more power we're able to gain. I'm learning it so I can pass the info on. The pay thing is a bit complicated because the glass ceiling is a thing that does exist. Yeah, exactly. Of like, that also is like this larger patriarchal system that's like, oh, we aren't going to pay you more in order to make you dependent on male partners. Do not consider Mesh Core secure. Oh, you can set up encrypted channels. That's cool. There's open channels, but yes, you don't have to use them. Always assume comms are compromised. Yes, because most of the time they are. And like in ways that like we can't possibly fathom without being on the back end of things. Like having worked in social media management, especially for the government, I'm like, there is so much information that all of these fuckers have on all of us, and we need to take our power back. We are pretty addicted to just being entertained into this stupor rather than like advocating, like wanting to be bored sometimes, having to sit with our thoughts and then realize like how angry we should be at larger society. Firstly, going to figure out how to encrypt channels on it. Yeah, that's great. I love that, especially having the encrypted options. As to underground. Ooh, okay. I'm saving this information. Thank you very much. Honestly, like the most enjoyable thing about streaming for me is like, as like nerdy as it is, or it may come across as like disingenuous or manipulative, but I like am sincere in saying this. It's like being able to learn from you all, people in the chat, like not being exposed to many different types of living walks of life, having more education. The US is transitioning from petrodollar back into data dollar. Yes, exactly. Especially when we're talking about like the techno feudalism of it all, that like we have essentially like this form of capitalism that Marx talks about, of like, oh, we overthrew feudalism to be in capitalism, and it's like, well, now we're in the same thing. Export destability and sell prediction control. Yes, like prediction markets, controlling people with data, how they own all of these media platforms and companies and news outlets. And they're also invested in the industrial war complex, where they are actively controlling how like the petrodollar is being destroyed. So like they are benefiting from whatever is happening. They meaning the ruling class.
That you want to engage in versus things that you feel pressured to do, rather than always being a hell yes. Because honestly, even if you're not asexual, I think requiring that everything always be something that you're actively hell yes about is seriously over optimistic of how much everybody always wants to have sex, because partners have different needs, different sex drive levels, and compromise, I think, is part of having an intimate relationship. Looking at it from a more kink focused perspective, you might be somebody that has a partner with a foot fetish, and maybe you're not really into foot stuff yourself, but you're willing to give your partner a foot job every once in a while because it makes them happy, because it's important to your
Petrodollar's
relationship.
over right now.
And
Yeah.
it's something that you're not like actively know about, even if it's not really your favorite thing ever. And so I think we should leave room for compromise, for doing things that our partners enjoy that we don't necessarily hate, and just allowing there to be a little bit of a gray area between absolutely no and actively hell yes. Especially if you're doing power exchange. You probably already know this, but oftentimes the most powerful part of a power exchange relationship is when you
can
do
also
things
slow it
purely for
down.
your partner's sake versus things that are
She's talking about consent, but also being an ace person. Sorry, Evie, this is not the most flattering frame. Talking about how that being an ace person, or like you don't have to be ace in order to understand that there are like these compromises within sexual interactions specifically, but how there is not always like how she's talking about this enthusiastic aspect of consent when it comes to sexual interaction, specifically within the Fry's model that she is describing that came from Planned Parenthood. That like not everyone will always be like enthusiastic about a lot of any sort of like sexual play, and that like that can be normal, like compromise can be normal. But she was like bringing up a foot fetish in particular, of like, even if you don't particularly like if someone is like really drawn to feet, like it's a foot fetish, but like you aren't like overjoyed all the time to like be giving a foot job. Like you still may, because of like you realize that like it is like a compromise, or like meaning something more to your partner. Anarchism is when no jobs but foot jobs. Oh, amazing.
For you. It's not necessarily that you hate the
I love that.
you're doing. It's kind of a meh, kind of a neutral, not my favorite thing ever. And the part of it that kind of fulfills your spirit is the fact that it's an act of devotion. It's an act of service for your partner in some way, because you enjoy suffering for them. And so there is a level of enjoyment. There is a level of, I want this. It just looks very different from maybe the stereotypical vanilla, hell yes, please put a penis in my vagina type consent. So there is nuance there, and I could probably make a whole video where I
that was such an ace way of saying that too.
I'll go ahead and put a pin in that one for now, because it is time to talk about the last part of the model, which is specific. Basically what this means is consent to do one thing does not mean that there is suddenly consent for a bunch of other stuff to happen. Just because you have said yes to A doesn't mean that you're okay with B. And just because you've said yes to A now doesn't obligate you to say yes to A in the future. I think the best way to talk about this from a kink perspective is to think about opt-in versus opt-out negotiation styles. With opt-in negotiation, only the things that you actively say yes to are okay. Whereas with opt-out negotiation, everything is fine except for the things that you say no to. And I think specificity is a really important part of having a good negotiation practice, because if somebody just says, yeah, beat me up, please. Let's go have fun. Unless you've negotiated for like a consensual non-consent dynamic, or it's somebody that you know super well, where you know exactly all of their buttons to push.
Beat me
That's
up.
not really a lot of
please.
information to work with. And it also shouldn't be taken that because somebody says yes to a paddle,
Very vague.
they say yes to this cane. Or because they say yes to DDLG, they're also saying yes to pet play, right? Being really narrow in what you consent to, being specific with it, I think is a great thing to practice and a great thing to keep in mind. And something else I really like with specificity is it's not just about saying yes to A or B, but also when is it okay to do this particular thing. You might say, yes, please call me a dirty slut during this scene or while we're having sex. That is specific to whatever moment you've negotiated for. Not call me a dirty
Big
slut
sister's
during
gonna
my
get
big work
me
meeting.
a
Not
leather
call me a
collar
dirty
as a
slut in
belated
front of my parents.
birthday
Not
gift.
call me a dirty
I
slut
remember
in
you
casual
saying this.
conversation or
I love
as
that.
a serious insult, right? So I
Also,
think thinking about that
supportive family.
specificity is really
That's
important.
great.
Again, unless you've negotiated otherwise.
You'll have to
And just to remind everyone,
let us
again,
know when you
the
get it.
Fry's model is a best practice
If you're part of the
model.
Discord,
It is not saying
which
that this is
no
how
pressure
all
to
consent
be,
should look under
but
all
you can always send
circumstances all the
pictures
time
there.
with everyone. It's more meant to be a guidepost for this is going to lead to the best possible outcome if you keep all of these steps in mind. Obviously, if you negotiate differently, if you have a higher risk tolerance, if it's a partner you know really well that you've been with for years, then yeah, your consent framework might look differently from this, and that's totally okay. Again, it's meant to be used as a guidepost, a reference point of things that you should keep in mind when you are evaluating how
Whenever you
give
bring
and
up
receive
collars, I
consent
just
in a
like
robust
happen to
manner.
have mine on the
Like I
desk,
said, I think
which
we're
is
gonna have
like
some further
not
conversations
the
related to
case
some kink
most of the
ethical
time.
framework, so make sure you
This is
subscribe if you
mine.
want to see that, as well as other kink and BDSM
My partner
related
made
videos.
this for
If you
me,
do have any comments or questions for me, you can put that down in the comment section below. If you
which
already
makes
support
it
my
extra
channel, if you're already
fun.
subscribed, I do recommend you go ahead and check out my Patreon. That has a bunch of additional resources, photo shoots, extra videos, things that I can't necessarily show here on YouTube. So please check that out if you haven't already. If you do already support me over there, thank you so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you guys next time, I hope you have a great
Synchronicity,
rest of your day
exactly.
and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.
This is so fun to have anarchist kingsters in the chat. This is not always what happens. I mean, it is whenever you show up, Aliana, but like people being like, oh yeah, like I know about this. We're on the same page. That's very fun. Okay. I did want to get into this. So, shifting gears a little bit, as we are talking about choking as a point of organizing, as in striking choke points, where we can withhold labor and actually be more strategic with how strikes are being implemented, especially with a lot of these trade unions and transportation unions, that there are very targeted ways to go about withholding labor so that we can halt the industrial war complex, halt a lot of these like larger global atrocities if they are being focused in a way that highlights like how this harm is actually even being done in the first place. So like with shipping and with weapons manufacturers and with communications, even how important it is to recognize like there is a lot of power there, but also in these various types of work that people can be extremely disempowered because of the actual power they do hold within collective organizing. So this is a video that we have watched in the past. So this is like jumping in the middle of things, which I realize is not always like the easiest to get right into things. But it's talking about strike threats, global supply chains, and choke point organizing. I am going to stitch these together and go through the different points that we have watched this posted on YouTube so that we actually get like a full overview of the entire topic, just because it's been like weeks in between each of these viewings, just depending on like the availability that I've had for the week. So I still want to highlight this. We will again watch it at a higher speed, but I saw New Yorkers flooding the streets for Knicks game sports ball, but won't for crimes against humanity. Yep. Exactly. This is something that like I was talking about with my partner. I was like, if we could take this energy and take it like 13 miles down the road where there is an ICE detention center. Like, there is a reason why they are afraid of us in mass, in numbers. And that, like, largely what we are fighting against, like, not only just in the US, but like on a global scale, but particularly in the heart of empire, is this disillusionment or this delusion that people are still living in of like these power structures and like buying into it. It's like, yes, they are systematized and imposed on us, particularly with law enforcement, but also how there is this disillusionment with our collective power. And if we could only inform people on what this actually looks like within like moving in mass, like we can push people towards a more like revolutionary way in taking our power back. But people are just very propagandized and brainwashed, and also experience these types of power imbalances in their daily life that they're like, oh, I guess there's no hope. And like I can feel pretty hopeless at times, because largely because of all of this like disinterest in being involved and actually fighting back. But like, this is where I think especially anarchist thought is extremely beneficial and important to be talking about. Of like, we don't need, like, when there are these atrocities happening, we don't have time. The people who are experiencing these things don't have time for incrementalism that often happens through electoralism. And even then, like, we don't get the end result that it's required, that actually leads to more collective liberation. That like, that's where a lot of anarchists actually say like, no, we need liberation now. And we have to be organizing in a way that is pushing towards that, because we don't have time. Philosophically, the perception of self used to be rooted in collective community, but is currently centered via an abstract concept of a nation state. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And then there's like this extra layer within American society in particular that's like this rugged individualism that is just gaslighting people into believing that if they just buy into the system, if they work hard enough, that they will be able to be part of this bourgeois ruling class, and that it is a way to continue to oppress people and propagandize them into not realizing their power. Either of you know much about technology? Depends on what it is. I'm very resistant to technology, which is ironic that I'm on this platform. And also have like done a lot of work in like digital marketing. But yeah, it depends on what it is for me. Okay, let's see where we left off with this.
Union organizing.
Certainly not there.
We do it to it.
We're seeing in terms of a supply, can be on pickets, talking about only 6 people on a picket. Now we've got.
Okay. It was around this area. We are to the choke point organizing part. You know where I can find an open source link for a remote control claw mechanism? I do not. One that you can make? I can look into this though. I can't promise I will be able to find something. Interesting. Yeah, I'll give it a look.
$2,000 workers out, hundreds of people on each picket, or surrounding them in rallies and demonstrations. So it's a powerful demonstration of workers' power. And to an extent, just to give you a bit of context.
Oh, that's really fast.
I mean, in the background of this, when you talk to the workers, obviously the issue is pay. It's also respect. In the background of this, we have the increased threat of automation, which is obviously there in all of the docks, increased attempts to bring in flexible working practices, tearing up terms and conditions. But what those workers are also fully aware of is that companies like the dockers companies, the shippers companies, the Maersks of this world, they're making more profits in the last year than they have in their entire history. Maersk, for example, made more profit last year than in the last 8 years combined. And workers can see that, particularly somewhere in docks where it's so overt, it's so in their face, they can see that. The idea that they have to pay for this crisis with a huge cost to their living standards is absolutely an absolute joke. But to give another little bit of context to this, and this comes back to some of the credible strike discussion, this was never supposed to be able to happen, according to the employers. This is absolutely an example of the workers calling the employers bluff on this one. So those workers at Felixstowe have not been on strike for 30 years. Furthermore, the investment went into Felixstowe in the 1980s and 1990s as an anti-union open shop port. So previously, before the 1980s, our union had a national agreement for Liverpool, London. I mean, we're an island nation. The docks are fundamentally important. Felixstowe is where the money went to try and break that agreement, and that's where really the it was always meant to be an anti-union port. So the idea that now that's the UK's largest container port, and now that's where the biggest strike that certainly our union is facing in this new strike wave is happening. There's no shortage of irony to that. And the disruption is immediately obvious, of course, in the docks itself, but now echoing down the supply chain, which is where it's very intriguing and exciting to see. It's something we've really discussed in theory in the past. So I mean, the disruption is obvious for the immediate company itself, and we've got, I know the shippers like to all make this claim, but we've got what is currently claimed to be the largest container port in the world, currently docked at Felixstowe, unable to move. We've got 5 other similar-sized container ships just outside Felixstowe, unable to come in. And while some of them are trying to be diverted to places like Thames Gateway or Southampton, because of the ongoing disruption after COVID, those ports are full. They're not able to simply move them. And at the same time, we're seeing solidarity statements from the comrades in Rotterdam port saying that they won't be accepting goods from Felixstowe. And as we speak, we're currently balloting the workers at the port of Liverpool to bring them out in dispute on their own issue of pay as well, which is significant because for the dock sector, Liverpool and Felixstowe, those are the 2 big pace setters or undercutters for pay across the whole dock sector. So if there's any opportunity to coordinate that, to bring those 2 disputes out at the same time, that's going to be fundamentally powerful. And what we're seeing in terms of supply chain disruption,
great
again,
find.
When I tend to deal with the automotive sector primarily, and several large factories across the UK, big brand names, their factories are now shutting. Those factories which haven't been able to move away from, they're still wedded to the just-in-time production model, they're very much now running out of components, only 4 days into this strike. And so they're going to be screaming at the port owner again and again. We're able to now map out that disruption, get estimates for the cost of that disruption, which is really, some of the things we've discussed in theory, we're now seeing play out in our union at least. And then, the docks have been discussed before. The docks are a traditional place where we talk about positional power or structural power. The second example to share really is inverting that. Whereas if we look at a car plant in the southern England, in Oxford, and Oxford is the most expensive city to live in the UK outside of London. It's a city mostly associated with universities and Harry Potter and things of that nature, not large-scale manufacturing, but nevertheless they have a significant car plant in Oxford. And like the rest of the automotive industry, that has been it's been a process where work has been outsourced, it's been subcontracted out, it's been fragmented, and therefore we've seen a growth of a supply chain even within the 4 walls of the plant, where different workers are under different employers, etc., etc. And what we've seen in the last year or so, really, and certainly culminating in the last couple of months, there was a small group of workers in a third-party logistics firm whose job it was to basically put the components onto the assembly line so the full-time workers could then be assembling the vehicles. Obviously, a huge position of structural power for that car plant, but those have always been the workers on the worst paying conditions, ununionized, the worst pay, etc., etc. Also, not coincidentally, the most demographically diverse group of workers, predominantly from East Timor, in fact. And they took a series.
So he's talking about exactly like what I was saying, that often people who are in these areas of work that actually are able to have more of an impact on the global supply chain, that they are the most disempowered with their wages, with union busting, and that is not for an accident.
Wildcat actions over the last year because on the question of pay, because they recognised their structural power and they were able to invert their traditional weakness into their strength, just as the automotive sector was going through a general supply chain crisis itself. Those workers continued that action. They've unionised now. They've taken official action. They took 1 day of formal action, costing the employer over £8 million due to lost production, and they won double-digit pay rises. Over
cool
20%.
to see this.
That was also followed by HGV
organizing in the chat.
Employer, supported by the core workers in that plant. So workers from 3 different employers coming together across the supply chain, defending paying conditions, and then advancing their pay over 20% in both cases. And it's important to say, I mean, this isn't just a question of pounds and pence and pay. This is a question of empowerment fundamentally. And the one thing I think which is intriguing in both of those cases, one where you have very traditional structural power, and one where there's been a later realisation of power from workers who have been fundamentally the most exploited in that plant. So very different starting points. On both of those picket lines, both at Felixstowe and at the car plant, the picket lines will have a very carnival festival atmosphere. There was singing, there was dancing, there was celebration. I mean, we always say as trade union officials, workers don't want to strike, and there's all the points that Robert just raised about that, about undermining strike credibility. But the reality is, the realisation those workers had of their power, and the feeling that came from that, it did result in a carnival atmosphere, particularly when they knew the disruption they were causing the employer. They knew the employer had to come back to them. And in the case of the car plant, they've won significant increases from that and increased their confidence accordingly.
So imagine that, workers actually realising their power, having like a sense of joy and celebration.
Recycling are going out across Scotland and potentially the rest of the country as well. So again, they're realising that structural power, even in places where traditionally, unlike the docks, it wasn't necessarily recognised by the trade unions. And that really is a real life demonstration, I think, of what we've been talking about in our research, really on paper. So the research that myself and my co-author Andrew Waterman contributed to the special issue, which Robert edited, was really looking at that more in theory in relation to a changing context the UK found itself as the UK left the European Union. Now, in the rest of the UK, that was broadly seen as a political process. We were very keen to understand it fundamentally as an industrial process. And really to understand, as we mentioned earlier, when we look at things such as trade particularly, which has now forced itself onto the trade unions agenda here after Brexit, when the UK hasn't had an independent trade deal since the 1970s, so we haven't looked at it as much as, say, the US trade unions would do. But even where that has been looked at, the trade unions' response traditionally is policy papers, it's social dialogue, it's trying to be a stakeholder, it's trying to get in the same room as the multinational employers and try and tweak the rules of trade somewhat. And that's failed for decades and decades, and there's no prospect of that strategy working now, particularly in this context. So what we really wanted to do in our research was, as a point of principle, invert that really, and look at not the rules of trade, but the act of trade. Absolutely, as has been demonstrated in Felixstowe, absolutely has been demonstrated by all those auto workers. And to try and understand really in that process.
Sounds good.
After the UK has come out of the European Union, as
It's
the rules have
deeper
changed,
too. Society is a reflection of
as we've now
ourselves,
had the
but so
pandemic,
is the
we've seen
universe.
the
Our
end of
power is
just-in-time supply
collective,
model,
but
or really
comes
that
from
fundamental
within.
supply chain model
Yeah.
breaking. What are employers' new strategies? How are they recalibrating what they're doing?
Which is why they try to, like, as we were talking about gatekeeping education and information, why it is so gatekept, why everything is so censored, why they are the ruling class, the 1%, buying up all of these avenues in which we can organize, which is like something Marx and Engels talk about, of like the means of communication to inhibit this type of organizing is directly influencing our perceptions of ourselves, and why they benefit by keeping us like endlessly entertained on their platforms and telling us what is culture, what isn't, rather than us developing our own opinions, developing our own thoughts, whether that's about like the culture that we like, the art that we like, the like sexual preferences that we like engaging in like conversations like that. It really is just like this larger way to dictate how we view ourselves so that they can control us as a collective. Reality is too big for any perspective. Institutions install representations to dictate our interpretations. Yes, exactly. Agreed.
Us to go on the offensive for our people. I mean, what are our strategies going to be to counter that? And I mean, it may sound like quite a twee example actually, but when we did our paper, the industry we chose to study for this, to find a case study, was actually the Scotch whisky industry. And the reason for that is that in Scotland, it's fundamentally important. There's thousands and thousands of people employed in Scotch whisky production, be that in small distilleries or be that in large bottling plants. And it's one of the #1 large exporting products that Scotland has. So when it comes to issues of international trade, Scotch whisky is always going to be a thing that trade negotiators have in trade deals with China, the United States, other countries as well. So it's fundamentally a trade issue, and it employs hundreds of thousands of people across Scotland. That's absolutely no exaggeration. But it's also an industry which has fundamentally shifted how it organises its supply chain. And it's also an industry where at every point in that supply chain, Unite is the majority union, in many cases the only union. And so there's an opportunity there to understand the fragmentation of that supply chain process, and then also look at how we could stitch it back together again through the union in order to identify structural positions of power in that supply chain. So for example, you'll have the distilleries, which will be creating raw product. You'll have the HGV drivers who'll be moving that to bottling plants, and every single HGV full of those spirits will be worth up to $1 million each. That's a huge amount, again, of structural power those HGV drivers will have. And then you'll have the bottling workers themselves. You'll have the workers making the glass bottles. You'll have the workers making the packaging. You'll have the workers taking the finished product to the docks, and then you'll have the dockers. And at every single stage of that process, they're all Unite the Union members. But traditionally, in the way that we've been structured, they're not people who talk to each other. That's like different industrial structures within the official movement. So bringing them together, allowing them to map the process, really using COVID as a case study as well. And then you can find the points of structural power, and then you can use them to invert the process. We've seen all the same issues of labour fragmentation, of subcontracting, of outsourcing. I previously mentioned the automotive sector was absolutely evident in that sector as well. And so we carried out that large case study as part of our work over the last year, sort of bring those workers together so they could fundamentally understand how the changing dynamics of trade would impact all of them down the supply chain, but then also how they could look to defend themselves and indeed go on the offensive to this large cartel of employers, such as Diageo, for example. You end up in a situation where 3 or 4 large multinational employers, they fundamentally control the entire production system, and we have to have an answer to that. So just in the last couple of minutes, really, in terms of the broader questions that particular case study and then these latter day examples have demonstrated, is the fundamental question for us is how are employers' strategies changing after Brexit, and then how do we respond to that? And there's sort of two things there. I mean, firstly, as the war in Ukraine has demonstrated, as the energy crisis has demonstrated, certainly in the UK and internationally, these crises are becoming more and more frequent, and there's no sign that's going to stop anytime soon. So the existing system that we've had in the UK, particularly the system of taut supply chains, of just-in-time supply, of removing the time, removing the cost, fundamentally using the supply chain system to drive down pay and drive down conditions, that's fundamentally broken now. So the employers have to respond to that. And what we're beginning to see, and all of these different examples have seen that, is a fundamental shift to smaller versions of what Gifford was talking about with the Inland Empire on a smaller geographical scale because we're a smaller country. But it's fundamentally the huge amount of investment in these massive mega shared warehouse and distribution units adjacent to major docks, And on top of that, as part of the employers and the government's program, is the new free ports, which have been introduced, including Felixstowe, which are tax-free hubs, anti-workers' rights hubs, essentially legal black holes, where all this money and investment is going into for new mega shared warehousing, Amazon fulfillment centres, etc., etc. So on the one hand, the UK is structurally changing around these big blocks of new unorganised workers. On the other hand, talking about what Gifford and Robert have talked about, those are fundamentally important structural positions now in the new UK economy as it's emerging after Brexit. So I'll finish my remarks there. Really, the only final thing to mention is in terms of Unite's response and the new things that Sharon Graham has done, and these are really just headlines we can bring out in the discussion. Robert mentioned Strike Fund. We now have a £50 million strike fund in Unite Union, which is supporting all of those disputes. That's the largest in the UK. There's been a big commitment to new research in Unite, particularly exploring profiteering, as I mentioned, Felixstowe, forensic accountancy, understanding multinational structures and company analysis, bringing that all in-house in collaboration with shop stewards who can do their own inquiries, as Robert's mentioned. And then the combine model, where we're bringing these workers together, as I've mentioned, different industries, to set the rate for the job, benchmark paying conditions, identify pace setters and undercutters, and go on the offensive and not just be on the defensive all the time. And so again, as I mentioned before, it's a fantastically exciting time to be in the UK labour movement, and particularly in Unite the Union. And thanks again for allowing me to share some of that with you. Happy to answer any questions and contribute to the discussion. But again, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks so much, Ben, for that sort of real-time reporting on the ground. Very, very exciting. And I just want to know, we are close to our closing time. We're going to go a little bit over time, but not too much. So I'm going to read some questions out, and then hopefully the three of you can pick which you want to answer. The first is from Joe Allen, who is a UPS worker and recently published an article called UPS: The Global Struggle, in which he sort of talks about UPS operating in 220 countries and territories around the world, and with their contract ending in, I believe it's next year's summer in 2023, workers are starting to organize, and sort of the perspectives from socialists in the union are particularly important. And he asks, what?
Okay, I do want to hear from their questions, but mostly I wanted to hear the rest of what this gentleman was saying. I've called it out in previous viewings of this video. I do think maybe this is me justifying splitting it up, but like it is helpful to have it in sections to kind of digest and analyze as well. But I have said before that, like, I wish they, not to diminish their experience or expertise and how they have been able to come to this point to be able to speak from a place of authority, but I do wish they had a little more diversity of the people who were educating. Okay. Let me see. I did want to watch this. Well, maybe I'll save this for tomorrow. Marx Part 3 by Philosophy Tube, Cultural Marxism and Political Correctness. Yeah, I think I'll do that, just so that we can give the reading the time it deserves. So we are continuing to read a manifesto of the Communist Party, more colloquially referred to as the Communist Manifesto, written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And they are talking about, in this section, communist and socialist literature. And this first part of this section is reactionary socialism. So we have already read part of this, but we are finishing it up. And I do have a video that I want to watch for tomorrow as well that talks more about like the differentiation between the types of socialists and communists that are talked about in this section. I dropped a primer for my philosophical framework in Discord. Apologies if inappropriate. I don't think it's inappropriate, just like with the things you've been saying here. Thank you for dropping it there, though, and thanks for joining the Discord. I'm glad to have you. It's good to have you. I was mixing those things. Very cool. And also, if there are like particular songs by that band, you can always drop things there. There's a channel, Art as Revolution. That's where like a lot of music or just like art is shared, but also like stream ideas. You can also fall under there too. Thank you for engaging. Very excited. Okay, so in this section, we just finished. So within reactionary socialism, we first read feudal socialism, middle class socialism, where it does talk about like this overseer class. So these are the landlords, these are supervisors that are still invested within these systems and benefit from these power differences in the workplace. I will be more Discord active outside of my workday. Yeah. And I will be the first to admit I'm not always the best at using the Discord. I am getting better. I'm getting a little bit better at it. I'm wanting to invest more there, especially for like the cool people who are interested in sharing ideas there. Okay, so now we are on part C, German or true, this is in quotations, true socialism. The socialist and communist literature in France, which originated under the pressure of a ruling bourgeoisie and was the literary expression of the battle against the rule, was introduced into Germany at a time when the bourgeoisie there had just begun its struggle against feudal absolutism. German philosophers, quasi-philosophers, and quote-unquote fine writers eagerly seized on this literature, only forgetting that with the importation of these writings from France, French social conditions had not likewise been imported. In contact with German social conditions, the French literature lost all its immediate practical significance and took on a purely literary character. Yeah, so like talking about the difference between the conditions that people are experiencing and how like one framework may not always be applicable to a particular moment in time or place, and how it is important to be looking at these nuances, especially within like the differences of the existing oppressive structures. It appeared merely as an idle speculation on the perfectibility of human nature. Thus, to the German philosophers of the 18th century, the demands of the First French Revolution were nothing more than demands of practical reason in general, and the manifestation of the will of the revolutionary French bourgeoisie signified in their eyes the laws of pure will, of necessary will, of true human will. The work of the German literati consisted exclusively in bringing the new French ideas into harmony with their philosophical conscience, or rather in appropriating the French ideas and accommodating them to their own philosophical point of view. This appropriation took place in the same way in which a foreign language is appropriated, by translation. It is well known how the monks wrote over the classical works of pagan authors. Yes, I can't snap with these gloves, but exactly. There is no universal truth is a universal truth. Yeah, the irony there, but also the truth of it there. Kind of like the aspect of like, there is no constant but change. It is well known how the monks wrote over the classical works of pagan authors, which in Western discourse, pagan usually just is like shorthand for indigenous. Pagan authors, or indigenous authors, the absurd tales of Catholic saints. Calling them absurd is amazing. The German literati reversed this process with the profane French literature. They wrote their philosophical rubbish beneath the French original. For instance, beneath the French criticism of the functions of money, they wrote alienation of the human entity. Beneath the French criticism of the bourgeois state, they wrote elimination of the supremacy of the abstract universal, etc. The introduction of this philosophical phraseology under the French historical criticisms, they christened philosophy of action, true socialism, German science of socialism, philosophical basis of socialism, etc. The French socialist communistic literature was thus completely emasculated. Oh, emasculated, you say? So again, talking about how we have to talk about this from like a decolonized lens, where that's viewing like emasculation as like a negative, like ultimate ill, and instead of like basing it into like a genderless way of talking about power structures. It is a paradox. If multiverse theory is true, there's a universe where it isn't. Yes, yeah, exactly. I love that comparison. And because it ceased in the hands of the Germans to express the struggle of one class against another, the Germans thought they had overcome French one-sidedness, and that they had defended instead of true needs, the needs of truth, and instead of the interests of the proletarians, the interests of human nature, of mankind in general. Man, who has no class and no reality except in shadowy realms of philosophical fantasy. This German socialism, which took its schoolboy task so seriously and solemnly and extolled it in such charlatan fashion, nevertheless lost little by little its pedantic innocence. So also in the same breath, like continuing this point that I have been saying of needing to come at everything from a decolonizing lens, but saying like pagan, but in the same breath, like it's a charlatan thing that like many traditions or perspectives that are viewed as being charlatan, also like that word comes from colonizers and applying like mysticism or like heresy to indigenous traditions. But in this manner, it's talking about like how there are these people who are like fake leaders imposing a theology that is just theology, or like philosophy that is not real. Nevertheless, lost little by little its pedantic innocence. The struggle of the German, especially of the Prussian bourgeoisie, against feudalism and absolute monarchy, in one word, the liberal movement, became more earnest. By this true, quote-unquote, true socialism was offered the much desired opportunity of confronting the political movement with the socialist demands, of hurling the traditional anathemas against liberalism, against representative government, against bourgeois competition, bourgeois freedom of the press, bourgeois law, bourgeois liberty and equality, and of preaching to the masses that they had nothing to gain, but, on the contrary, everything to lose by this bourgeois movement. German socialism forgot, very conveniently, that the French criticism, whose foolish echo it was, presupposed modern bourgeois society, with its corresponding conditions of existence, and the political constitution adapted thereto, precisely the things whose attainment had yet to be fought for in Germany. It served the absolute governments with their following of priests, pedagogues, country squires, and officials, as a welcome scarecrow against the threatening advance of the bourgeoisie. Paraphrase Zizek. Joke, I ordered a black coffee without cream. They had no cream and offered a black coffee without milk. It tasted the same, but the lack was off. Yeah, exactly. Amazing. It was a sweet compliment to the bitter floggings and bullets which these same governments administered to the rebellious working class of Germany, while quote-unquote true socialism served as a weapon in the hand of the government against the German bourgeoisie. It also directly represented a reactionary interest, the interest of the German middle class. In Germany, the middle class, transmitted from the 16th century and since then constantly reappearing under various forms, is the real social basis of the existing state of things. Its preservation implies the preservation of the existing state of things in Germany. The industrial and political supremacy of the bourgeoisie threatens it with certain destruction, on the one hand from the concentration of capital, on the other hand from the rise of a revolutionary proletariat. True, quote unquote, true socialism appeared to kill both birds with one stone. It spread like an epidemic. The garment, woven of speculative cobwebs, embroidered with flowers of rhetoric and saturated with the dews of sickly sentiment, this transcendental garment in which the German socialists enveloped their pitifully emaciated eternal truths only served to increase the sale of their goods to the public. On its side, German socialism recognized more and more its own vocation as the pompous representative of the petty bourgeoisie. It proclaimed the German nation to be the model nation, and the German petty bourgeoisie to be the normal man. It gave to each baseness the latter an occult, superior, socialistic meaning, the exact contrary of its own character. It went to the extreme length of directly opposing the brutally destructive tendency of communism, and of declaring its impartial and lofty superiority to all class struggles. With very few exceptions, all that is circulated as socialist and communist writing in Germany belongs to this foul and enervating literature. There we go. Just, really, providing some biting commentary on the German literature that had been insufficient up to this time, that they were writing the manifesto of the Communist Party. Engels and Marx and Engels. Politics is downstream from culture, or the substructure determines the superstructure. Yes, exactly. And this is why we have all of these people in the ruling class that are so determined to dictate what culture is. And that a lot of the time it is this larger attempt of continued colonizer tactics and ethnic cleansing, because anything that exists outside of the framework of this like cis-het patriarchal ableist colonizer perspective of dominance, non-consensual dominance, it is a threat. And that this also is a reflection of like the types of marginalization that exist, of like, oh, we can't view women as equal when there have been matriarchal societies that have existed before, so we have to eliminate all references to this. We can't hold nuance when it comes to gender to uphold this type of patriarchy, and acknowledge that in many cultures and societies that there are many types of genders. There's gender diversity and expansiveness. Like, I identify as Hydra, which is a Desi third gender, or like a third gender in many Desi cultures, and that colonization was very bent on erasing any sort of reference to us and erasing our personhood, erasing our humanity, but also like erasing our lives in general, and like how this is just a continuation of these colonizer practices to impose non-consensual domination and uphold these hierarchies of human dignity that the ruling class are benefiting from, while most of us do not. British Empire sentenced my family to Australia. I have an Irish name and no connection to past or culture. Yeah, colonizer shit. That's what these empires do. That's why I think, like, correct me if I'm wrong. Hello, Stuart Little is my son. Welcome. That I think there is much more of like an anti-establishment kind of like anarchist lean that is more popularized among the Australian populace because of that history of people being like in the UK, like, oh, you can't be here, you're a criminal, like whatever that means, whatever they're defining as crime. And it's part of like these larger ethnic cleansing projects that they're like, okay, we're going to send you away. And then people are mad. They're upset about that, and for good reason. But yeah, that's like being separated from culture, like what you were saying before, like that is a way to impose this power, to maintain their power, to keep people ignorant and disconnected from their heritage. Okay, think that's going to be it for me today. Tomorrow is Friday, thank God. For those of us who are having a weekend, happy weekend tomorrow. But we'll be going over Culture Corner as we are ending on culture. This is a very great segue into what we'll be talking about tomorrow. And there are a number of things that I want to be talking about within like entertainment and beauty standards that we'll be talking about, but also get to some of these things that I didn't today, like this video by Vijay Prashad about decolonization via a Marxist lens. And I am very interested in watching that. I have not seen any of it. And then get into more of this conversation of the difference between someone who views themselves as like a tried and true communist versus a reactionary socialist. So just getting more into some of the details there. Aussies keep a larrikin good-humored way of undermining authority. If guards laughing, they can't beat us as hard. Yeah. Exactly. Where it's like they are afraid of us seeing through these power structures. And if we, like, our laughter, like, making fun of them, like, that's why, like, satire is so important. Like, they are very afraid of us seeing through all of this and what that can mean for collective organizing and resistance. Okay, that's going to be it for me today. But thank you for joining today. It was great meeting you, Anarcho Taco. And I'm glad you're able to join the Discord. I'll be more active there. So I am very interested to see what your philosophy is that you dropped there. So thank you very much. But I will be returning again tomorrow, but I think more around 2:30 p.m. Mountain Time. Peace, power, love, and rage. Exactly. Love that. Power to the people. I hope you have a good rest of your day, evening, and I will see you soon. Okay, bye.